Sup, my fellas, don't forget to leave feedback and enjoy the story. The main character Hans thought that everything in his life was going wrong. Hans found himself in DeLuca's labyrinth. There were pools of blood everywhere as well as scattered swords. The hero lay next to an almost broken column. Hans sat and said that he thought everything would be simpler. He also wondered if the enemy had always been so strong. Hans was wearing a hood and a mask that hid his face. Hans thought that his body was too weak. He looked forward and saw in front of him a monster ruling this labyrinth. Duel looked like a bull and was also furious. Hans began to rise to his feet. Standing up, Hans said that if he did not kill Duel, he would die himself. Duel rushed to the attack and began to scream, and the aura emanating from him intensified. Hans also rushed to the attack, holding a wooden shield in front of him. As soon as they got close, Duel immediately swung his huge axe. Screaming furiously, Duel struck with his axe. However, Hans put up a shield and blocked this attack. The blow was so strong that the ground under Hans began to crack. The hero was able to deflect the blow into the ground. Since the shield cracked from this, Hans immediately threw it away. He then ran forward as the yellow aura emanating from him began to intensify. In an instant, Hans found himself at Duel's feet, which shocked Duel. A yellow glow emanated from Hans' mask as his aura continued to intensify. With a dash, Hans was able to pierce Duel with his sword. The monster let out a terrifying death cry. His axe fell to the ground. Everything around was filled with blood, and Hans, with a bloody sword in his hands, stood in front of the monster's body. Duel was defeated. He lay in a pool of his own blood. Hans' mask was bloody. He said that DeLuca still has the same weaknesses. Unlike other minotaurs, Duel's heart is located on the right side of his chest. Approaching the skulls of the warriors killed in battle, Hans said that they did not know about this weak point of Duel. Their attacks were directed to the left side, where, according to them, the heart should be, which is why they died. After the warriors attacked DeLuca on the left side, the monster immediately cut them down with his axe. Hans knows this because he killed Duel 1,000 times. Hans turned around and said about some place that should be not far from here. He started walking towards this place. Hans stopped and raised his head, saying that this was what Duel had guarded so carefully. Hans stood in front of the huge gate. He began to open this gate and was illuminated by the light emanating from the other side of the gate. He raised his head and saw a bright yellow light, similar to the sun. Hans stepped inside the room where the gold coins were scattered. Looking ahead, Hans said that everything turned out as he thought. The hero found himself in a room filled with gold and jewelry. He approached the throne, on which lay some kind of knife. Hans picked up this dagger and a green aura began to emanate from it. He realized that he had already seen it all. Hans said that he is in the game of Black Bow Ring. The green aura emanating from Hans only intensified. The hero was clearly unhappy with the situation in which he found himself. Then the action moves to the bar. The two men were discussing the news, namely that someone had defeated a cruel minotaur. Behind them sat a black-haired man who is Hans. The men behind him, meanwhile, were wondering who had defeated this minotaur. The waiter approached the table where Hans was sitting. The waiter handed Hans his portion and said that judging by his clothes, he was either a mercenary or a traveler. The waiter crossed his arms and asked Hans where he came from. Taking a sip, Hans said that he came from the village of Aram. Hans did not want to look him in the eyes and sat with his head down. Then the waiter asked if this was the northern village that had recently been exterminated. Hans raised his wooden mug and asked if he should answer this question. The waiter put his hand on Hans's shoulder and apologized regretfully, saying that he really didn't have to answer. The guy also said that his friend was in this village. That's why he asked. Hans chewed his food dissatisfied, and the waiter asked him to forget about this issue. Hans realized that perhaps he knew which friend the waiter was talking about. However, this has nothing to do with Hans. The hero remembered the day when the village began to burn. Hans put on his cape and left the village, taking with him only a bag and a weapon because he was just a stranger with no connections. Hans' eye was bloody. He sat on the floor and held his face, saying that he had a severe headache. He looked at his hand and was surprised to see blood. Suddenly, someone nearby began to shout and call everyone around, and therefore Hans also paid attention to this. In front of him stood several guards in armor and with spears, who shouted that they needed to protect the village. One of the guards rushed into battle. Hans, meanwhile, looking at him, wondered why their costumes looked like they were from the Middle Ages. Hans thought they were making a movie here. At the same time, he realized that everything looked very familiar to him. Hans saw something terrifying and also heard screams. Some monster pierced the guard with its paw. This monster then threw the dead guard to the ground. Hans saw the silhouette of the head of this monster. The creature had the head of a wolf. The moment Hans saw the monster, everything became clear. Hans saw the wolf and realized that it was a two-legged monster similar to a wolf, wolfkin. Hans turned his gaze to the bodies of the dead guards and began to recognize them. The hero was shocked because he realized that these people were from the Black Bow Ring. Suddenly, memories of the moment when his parents chose his name came flooding back to him. He He also remembered the friends he made as a child. A lot of memories and people he didn't know before popped into his head. Hans grabbed his head and started screaming. He wondered if these were all his body's memories. He lowered his head and said that those who had just died were Jorba and Baden. He looked ahead and this place seemed familiar to him. Hans looked ahead and saw a wolf surrounded by the dead bodies of guards. Hans said that this place is the starting point of the Black Bantha Ring, Aram village. Suddenly Wolfkin began to sniff. He immediately noticed Hans and looked at him. The young man was terrified. Wolfkin rushed to the attack. Hans stood up and saw an axe lying on the ground nearby. He understood that if he did nothing, he would die. The hero picked up the axe from the floor, thinking that he needed to remain as calm as possible. Hans was afraid of the fight, but still put the axe in front of him. The monster continued to growl and run straight towards him. Wolfkin was about to pierce Hans with his claws just as he did with the guard. The axe handle broke and the monster's blow reached Hans. From this blow the hero was thrown back. Hans was shaking violently and crawling somewhere, wondering if he would really die like this. Wolfkin began to slowly approach him. The monster looked straight into Hans's eyes. The hero was stunned and scared, but he did not want to die here. Hans looked at the monster in horror and tried to crawl further. He tried to move, but his hands were shaking. Hans was unable to crawl away and the monster ended up right in front of him. Suddenly a red-haired young man shouted Hans' name. This young man immediately rushed to the attack. The red-haired boy swung his spear, but Wolfkin managed to dodge. Having driven the monster away a little, the red-haired boy turned around and asked Hans how he was feeling. Hans asked in surprise that this guy could really be Flop. Flop bared his teeth and angrily asked Hans why he sat there, because he could die. Wolfkin, meanwhile, began to growl furiously at them. Flop looked at him and, raising his spear, exclaimed that he was talking to Hans. Then he threw his spear at the monster with all his might. The spear pierced the monster's skin and wounded him. Blood gushed out from his wound. Flop held a metal shield in front of him and began to draw his sword from behind his back. He rushed into the attack and, swinging his sword, exclaimed that Wolfkin should die. Calling the wolf a mongrel, Flop pierced him right through with his sword. Most of the village was engulfed in flames. The monster was defeated and his body lay on the ground, and Flop returned the sword to its sheath and turned to Hans sitting on the ground. The hero sat with his head down. Flop asked how long Hans would sit here. The hero looked to the side and said that he was not Hans. Flop looked at him with confusion and said that Hans had gone crazy and this was a typical problem for those who had no real experience. He also said that Hans was bothering him, and therefore it was better for him to help others with weapons or do something else. Flop once again looked questioningly at Hans, who was silent. It was clear from Hans' eyes that he was really confused and didn't understand what was happening. Flop got angry and grabbed Hans by the clothes, shouting that he was really going to ignore him. Flop shouted that Hans knew where the vault was. He also asked him to stop pretending and go to work. Hans seemed to be walking in the dark, and the ground under his feet was strewn with corpses and pools of blood. The hero realized that he seemed to have inhabited the body of a guy whose name was Hans. The hero's soul was in Hans' body. The hero did not understand why he was here and who this Hans was. He decided that it was more important for him to understand how to survive here. Hans sighed languidly. He looked exhausted. He looked to the side and wondered how this was even possible. However, what he knew for sure was that monsters with a fox-like character and a talent for hunting, called wolfkins, lived here. They take over vaults to hunt people. There were many wolfkins walking around the village. Hans thought that several days had already passed since the ambush, which meant that they had already destroyed the storage facility. Hans said he knows this because this is the first training in the Black Bow Ring. Hans looked forward in surprise. He smiled and said that this is where the adventure of the hero of Cadiz begins. He realized that this was the only chance of salvation for a weakling like him. Hans immediately ran somewhere. For some time Hans ran somewhere, after which he stopped and took a breath. Hans looked ahead and said with a smile on his face that this was a great place. He stood in front of the stables. He went into it, but there were no people there. Hans looked unhappy and covered his nose and mouth with his hand. It smelled terrible there because the horses had not been cleaned up for a long time. He picked up some strange brown stone and said that this was needed in order to get rid of the human smell. He looked at this brown stone with horror and said that he needed to put his pickiness aside. He started to completely coat himself with it. While he was doing this, cries for help were heard outside. However, Hans understood that in order to survive, he should not worry about other people. Biting his lip, Hans angrily said that he still couldn't help them. Hans sat cowering under the window while cries for help could be heard from there. Someone else's screams were heard outside, as if someone was starting to fight. Hans was surprised and interested in what was happening there. He stood up and looked into the hole. Hans exclaimed joyfully that the man had finally arrived. There was a man standing there in a cape with a blue aura emanating from him. Hans knew that this was the player character who raided the Wolfkins and became the hero of the Silver Moon. This character, whose name is Cadiz, was dressed in armor and also wore a mask. Hans said that at the end of the training, the king of wolfkin will be the main boss. A wolfkin immediately appeared, dressed in armor, from which, moreover, a yellow aura emanated. Hans knew it was a silver mane, Durkin. Durkin seemed to smile and look at Cadiz. However, Cadiz was not going to retreat and also looked at him. Suddenly they took off and began to approach each other. It seemed that in a moment Cadiz would defeat Durkin. However, moments later, Durkin cut Cadiz in half without giving him a chance. Hans was shocked. He did not expect Cadiz to die. After all, Hans knew that losses were inevitable, but Cadiz had to live. Looking at Cadiz's dead body, Hans wondered why this happened. Hans lowered his head and began to repeat that this was not the end. Suddenly he remembered that games have a revival system. Hans smiled and thought that Cadiz would come back because it was just a game. However, Cadiz's lifeless body was still lying on the floor. Hans closed his eyes and exhaled, thinking that he needed to calm down. Hans gathered his courage and clenched his fist, realizing that if Cadiz did not return, the only one who could save Hans was himself. Hans immediately hit himself in the face with his fist. He was as calm as possible. Hans said that if the training went as expected, he would have another chance. The village was still on fire. The hero thought that he knows this world and understands it well. Hans approached Cadiz's body. Standing in front of Cadiz's corpse, Hans said that in order to survive, he had to try something. Hans crouched and leaned towards the sword. At the same time, he thought that he liked playing for Cadiz. As Hans brought his hand to Cadiz's sword, a yellow aura began to appear around him. Hans saw Cadiz's memories of him training. He also saw how Cadiz fought a huge bear. In one of the memories, he also saw Cadiz's face, which was half burned. That's why Cadiz put on a mask so that people wouldn't see his face with burns. Hans covered one eye with his hand. He raised the sword and looked at it in surprise because a yellow glow emanated from it. Then he went to some unfinished building. The moon was visible behind Hans. He thought that if his assumptions were correct, there was only one possibility of survival. Hans stood on the edge of the roof of an unfinished building. Hans walked to the very edge. The height of the building was quite large. Hans looked down in fear and wondered if he had done the right thing. However, he immediately decided that there was simply no choice here because he had to take advantage of the right moment. Durkin was still wandering around the village. Hans calmly looked into the distance and said that he needed to jump. Hans saw Durkin from above and waited until Durkin was close enough. Some kind of purple magic stone was visible on Durkin's neck. Hans tried to muster up his courage and gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. The hero jumped from a height. Hans grouped himself because he had plans for this jump. Hans pointed his sword with the blade down, falling at great speed. Durkin looked around and did not suspect that they would now try to kill him. Hans struck with his sword and shouted for Durkin to die. He thrust the sword into Durkin and blood gushed out of the monster. Durkin began to scream in pain. He turned around and saw Hans sitting on his back, holding his sword. Durkin began to kick and try to throw Hans off of him, but the hero was able to hold onto the sword. Hans grabbed the sword even harder and called Durkin a dog. Durkin turned around and looked at Hans. The hero asked if Durkin knew what it was. Hans, with an angry face, stuck the sword even deeper and exclaimed that this was Durkin's spine. The monster's eyes widened in frantic pain. Durkin fell to his knees. While Durkin squatted in shock, Hans pulled the sword out of him. Hans raised his sword in front of him, preparing to strike again. However, he did not have time to do this and Durkin threw him to the side. Hans was lying on the floor next to a destroyed wooden fence. Lying on the ground, Hans looked at Durkin and wondered if he had not plunged the sword deep enough. Hans's eyes began to close, but not before he saw the bloodied Durkin walking towards him. The hero realized that everything was not going according to plan. Durkin was even angrier and began to show his teeth, growling threateningly. Suddenly a voice was heard asking that he was wondering why there were no corpses in the warehouse. Hans saw someone's leg. This man said that Hans was already here. Suddenly this man jumped up and rushed to attack. This man turned out to be Flop. He jumped on Durkin from behind, intending to attack him, and asked Hans what he thought was a warehouse. Durkin turned around and ducked slightly to lunge as Flop flew towards him with his sword pointed at him. Flop plunged the sword straight into the monster's arm, blood gushing from his wound. Flop got angry and bared his teeth. A moment later, Durkin struck him and cut off his hand with his claws. Flop was thrown into the same place as Hans. Blood poured from Flop's wound, but he still tried to get up. At the same time, he asked Hans what he was doing and why he didn't run away as usual. However, Hans understood that if he ran away now, he would not be able to kill Durkin. Hans calmly looked at Flop and asked why Flop was fighting if he knew he had no chance against Durkin. There was anger on Flop's face. He began to shout that he promised himself to live. Suddenly, Flop's eyes began to close and he began to lose consciousness. Flop lost consciousness and fell to the ground while his wound continued to bleed. Hans suddenly remembered how he and Flop stood on the edge of the cliff. Flop yelled at Hans and said that he just wanted to run away. Flop looked at him seriously and said that he would become much stronger so that this would never happen again. It turned out that they were standing near someone's grave. As Flop left, he called Hans a coward. The action moves to the present and a yellow aura appears around Hans. The hero said that he didn't care because he was not Hans. The hero clenched the hilt of his sword while the aura around him continued to intensify. He said he would do anything to survive. Hans held out his sword and the silhouette of Cadiz appeared behind him. Hans began to run towards Durkin. The hero understood that the monster was already in critical condition. The enraged monster waved his hand. Hans looked at him and realized that he could already see his movements. Durkin struck with his claws, but Hans dodged. Hans then got into a fighting stance. Hans lunged and made an attack, slashing with his sword. However, nothing happened and Hans seemed to only cut the ribbons on Durkin's shoulders. This attack made the monster even more angry. Hans got down on one knee. He lowered his head and grinned, wondering if it was all over. Suddenly, wounds appeared on Durkin's torso. Blood gushed onto the ground. Hans laughed joyfully, and the blood of Durkin, who he had just killed, spilled onto him. The defeated monster fell to the ground. After some time, Hans was already in the house. He lay down on the bed and sighed with relief. Looking at the ceiling, Hans said that this was just some kind of madness. He thought that he felt strange in the village of Aram, but the moment he attacked the crypt of Acrovenia dungeon, his theory was confirmed. Hans remembered that room strewn with gold. In that very place he had sensations just like when playing with the black bow ring. The hero said that the funny thing is that he is now in Hans' body. From his emerging memories, the hero realized that Hans seemed like an ordinary villager. There is nothing remarkable about him. There is absolutely nothing except his own name. Lying on the bed and looking somewhere to the side, the hero said that in essence he had simply been reincarnated. Suddenly Hans stood up and said that now it seemed to him that he was not at all empty-handed. For some reason, memories of Cadiz and his skill with a sword are firmly lodged in the hero's head. Hans clenched his fist and thought that there was still work to be done. He reached out in front of him and tried to bring up the status window, but nothing happened. Hans started shouting different phrases, trying to bring up the status window, but in the end he came to terms with the fact that there was no status window. Some time passed and morning came. Hans woke up and stretched relaxed, yawning at the same time. Hans looked sleepy, but was already thinking that after collecting information by asking the villagers over these few days, he had concluded that the world was no different from before. Looking in the mirror, Hans thought that if this is the world of the black bow ring that he remembers, then there are different heroes here. Hans put on his mask and identified the most important task for him now. Hans said that his main task now is to find Paval Codman, a playable hero who, like Cadiz, is staying in this village. Going out into the street, Hans reflected that he already knew that Paval would be staying at the same hotel as him. Hans left the house and accidentally hit the door of a man passing by. In front of him stood a blue-haired guy with a crossbow on his back who was holding onto the bruise he had just received. Hans was shocked and wondered if it really was Paval Codman. After some time, they were already sitting at the bar, and their table was strewn with various goodies because Hans decided to treat Paval as an apology for what happened. Paval happily said that everything was fine, but he understood that Hans would not accept his refusal. Meanwhile, Hans thought that now his only goal was to become Paval Codman's comrade. Paval picked up a knife and fork and cut a piece of steak. He brought a piece of steak to his mouth, and then he ate it. After that, he looked at Hans and said that he looked like a mercenary or a traveler. Suddenly Paval asked if Hans was interested in the large-scale enslavement of Anthro. Hans looked at him and thought that all he was interested in was Paval. Putting his hand to his chin, Hans asked why Paval thought so. Paval looked at him intently, after which he put his spoon on the table. Paval looked at the mission board and said that everyone left for this mission in the morning, and Hans was still here. Paval chuckled as Hans replied that they were both still here. Hans also said that these mercenaries do not have a worthy leader, and therefore they are going to certain death. Paval looked at him with a sly smile and asked if Hans was really waiting for a monetary reward, just like him. Hans began to get up and said that he was not interested in money. The hero headed to the cash register, at the same time telling Paval that he needed a faithful companion with whom he would subdue Anthro. However, in his thoughts Hans understood that he did not need a companion, but a shield. The cashier happily asked Hans if he needed help with the payment, but Hans was holding a bag full of gold in his hands. Hans understood that if he solved Paval's financial problems, then Paval would easily become his comrade because this guy is driven by money. Hans laid out several gold coins on the table and Paval looked at it in surprise. Paval smiled slyly and said in his thoughts that Hans was richer than it seemed at first glance. Paval turned around and said that he was more comfortable fighting alone, but if Hans survived this mission, then he would think about working together. After some time, they were already in a forested area surrounded by mountains. Hans and Paval walked together through a forest dotted with huge trees. Along the way, Hans thought that he didn't care about heroic things and saving the world. Hans had already decided that Paval would become a hero, and he would only be his companion, helping him on his difficult journey. Looking ahead, Hans reflected that all he wanted was safety and a guarantee that he would not be killed. He looked at Paval and thought confidently that Paval was the ideal person whom he could trust. As Paval crouched down and began to survey the area, Hans reflected that Paval was a hunter well versed in traps and dungeon strategies, who was an easy difficulty character in the game. Paval picked up the branch and, showing it to Hans, said that this was the root of Anthro, but Hans at that moment wondered whether all of the above meant that Paval's likelihood of survival was higher. Paval looked into the distance and said that very soon they would reach Anthro's, and therefore he wished Hans good luck. The hero also wished him good luck, exclaiming in his thoughts that he believed in Paval. After a while, they were already fighting against a monster tree, which had already killed many warriors. Hans sat behind a tree and, while eating popcorn, asked about something he could just watch from the sidelines. Paval, meanwhile, selflessly fought the monster. He took aim for the shot and the air currents around him began to intensify. Paval fired and hit the monster right in the eye. The monster immediately hit Paval, but only broke the branch because Paval managed to jump to another branch. Paval took aim again and jumped, saying that it would take at least 3 shots to take down this Hulk. Jumping from branch to branch, Paval continued to shoot at the monster. The monster, whose eye was damaged, began to scream angrily. The monster hit him with its branch, but Paval dodged and jumped away. Falling down and taking out some red stone from his bag, Paval asked if the monster even knew how much this thing cost. Hans raised his head and said that it was a red-colored stone that exploded on impact. The red flower stone that Paval was holding in his hand began to glow. Hans saw this and thought that their thoughts were similar. Paval threw this stone at the monster. Then he immediately took aim. Paval fired from a crossbow. The arrow that Paval shot broke the red-colored stone into 2 parts. Because of this, the stone began to glow even more. The stone split into several parts and changed its shape, and its glow only intensified. The shell ended up right next to the monster's eye. A moment later there was a powerful explosion. Everything around was in smoke. However, even through the thick smoke, it was clear that the eye of the tree monster was completely destroyed. Hans raised his head and looked at this and thought that Paval had exceeded all his expectations. Hans was glad, because he understood that at this rate he could easily deal with Anthro. Hans watched this from afar. He saw that Paval was standing at the foot of the monster. Hans mentally exclaimed that Paval would definitely become a hero. Paval was completely focused. He took the crossbow in his hands and took aim to shoot again. Paval pulled the trigger, but there was a misfire, which took Paval by surprise. Paval looked at his crossbow in horror. Then he raised his head and looked at the monster in fear. The monster smiled and looked joyfully at Paul. The wooden limbs of the monster almost overtook Paval. One moment and the monster killed Paval, squeezing him with its wooden limbs. Hans was so shocked that he even dropped his bucket of popcorn. Hans remembered how Cadiz died and said that even though Cadiz died, Paul did not seem so weak. Hans raised his head and wondered how his weapon could break at such a crucial moment. Hans looked forward and said that this was some kind of nonsense. The monster leaned over and noticed Hans. The hero, standing in front of the monster and holding his sword in his hands, said that everything had gone awry. He understood that now, after Paul's death, he must concentrate on a new business. The monster looked at Hans with a mad smile, and Hans, raising his head, looked at him and thought that he had no other choice but to fight Anthro. Hans immediately took off, but Anthro had already attacked him with his roots. Hans knew it would be tough, but with the sword skills he learned from Cadiz, he had a chance. Hans immediately cut through Anthro's roots with his sword, which emitted a yellow aura. Hans looked ahead and thought that in order to definitely win, 2 more things were needed. Firstly, he needs Paval's bag with red stones. The hero immediately turned towards the bag and ran after it. However, Anthro continued to attack Hans with his roots. Fortunately, the hero managed to escape and grabbed a bag with red stones. Paval's silhouette appeared behind Hans. Hans looked at his hand and said that he also needed Paval's ability. Anthro swung his hand while Hans stood calmly in place. Finally, Anthro's hand reached its target and he hit Hans. However, the hero managed to dodge the blow by jumping to the side. Immediately Hans began to approach the monster, moving along his hand. Anthro was surprised and began to growl as Hans got closer and closer. Anthro started screaming so loudly that he was able to stop Hans. The hero covered himself with his hands because Anthro's scream affected him. The sound waves reached Hans and threw him back, and therefore he could not get closer. Suddenly, for some reason, Hans returned the sword to its sheath. He picked up the dagger and a yellow aura appeared around him. A projection of Paval appeared behind Hans, as if Hans was repeating his movements. The hero thought that now he had something more than the art of wielding a sword. Hans swung his hand and threw the dagger. Hans hit Anthro in the face with his dagger, which silenced him. The dagger stuck right between Anthro's eyes, who looked at Hans with his mouth open. The hero, horrified, raised his head and said that he had seen this scene many times, but that did not cease to make it less creepy. Looking at the terrifying face of Anthro, who looked at Hans with his mouth open. The hero thought that the only way to defeat Anthro was to destroy the core on his face. Hans reflected that for travelers who see him for the first time, the battle turns into despair and acceptance of their own demise. All the monsters' heads came out from behind and looked at Hans, who was standing on its roots. Hans calmed down and, looking at the monster, thought that it was the same with him, but now he knows something. Looking at one of Anthro's heads, Hans said that he knew the monster's weakness. The Anthro's heads rushed forward and began to approach Hans. However, the hero immediately jumped. He jumped over the head and jumped away from it, and then headed further to climb the monster. One of the heads came close to him, but Hans calmly continued to walk forward, realizing that the monster had the same attacks as in the black bow ring. The aura around Hans intensified. He decided that he needed to hit the monster before he screamed. Hans struck and cut open one of Anthro's heads. Hans jumped and the other two heads of the monster turned their attention to him because he was right in front of them. Making a dash, the hero stuck his sword into the monster. Hans hung right between the eyes of this monster, holding onto the sword stuck into him. The monster screamed in surprise and some kind of blue stone appeared from its mouth. Hans let go of his sword and jumped back. He quickly took out his dagger. The first thing he did was throw Paval's bag into the monster's mouth. After that, he threw his dagger there. The monster watched all this in shock. Meanwhile, the dagger broke the red flower stone. The monster closed its mouth. The explosive red stone was already in its mouth, and therefore a characteristic red glow was visible from there. Falling to the ground, Hans said goodbye to Anthro and called him names, showing an obscene gesture. A moment later, there was a powerful explosion. The monster was blown to pieces. Hans held his head and said that this was madness. Hans took off his helmet and took it in his hands. He thought that he had the skills to wield the sword of Cadiz. He also has Paval's throwing ability. Hans clenched his fist and said in his thoughts that he seemed to be able to absorb abilities. Walking through the forest, Hans thought that this world had great hopes for him. Hans covered his face with his hand with displeasure and thought that he did not want this, and also said that he would never become a hero. Hans went to Malik Castle. He expected to see there some person he needed now. Hans understood that in order to get to Malik Castle, he needed to fight a boss of medium difficulty. This monster is Hamel, a martyr thirsting for darkness who fights with his weapon. Hans thought that everything would have been simpler if Paval had not died, but now, in order to kill Hamel, he needs a tool that can help him. After some time, Hans was already in the village of Calyx. Hans saw a gray cat in the distance, slowly stretching. Hans stood in front of some arch in the alley. He approached a door, near which a guard stood. Hans stopped right in front of him. He turned to him and said the code phrase Bell of Wisdom. The guard smiled and it became clear that one of his teeth was gold. Hans was opened a passage somewhere underground. Going down, the hero thought that if he remembered correctly, he could find this tool here. Hans went downstairs. It was dark and damp. It turned out that this is an underground brokerage office Owl's Nest, which many people come to. Hans wandered around this underground office. He stopped in front of some place and saw several girls nearby. One of the girls, the one with blue hair, drew attention to him. She extended her hand to him and, saying that he was apparently new, asked if he needed help. Hans briefly refused, saying that he was already used to it. The girl was stupefied by his answer. She could not understand what he was used to and who he even was. While he was walking, he thought that the black bow ring had an incredibly high difficulty level. Having opened some kind of screen, Hans thought that in order to at least slightly reduce the difficulty of passing, newcomers come here. Hans walked past the cage in which people were kept. He approached the cage in which the gray-haired girl was sitting. He pointed his finger at her and said that he chooses her, and therefore she is now his unique instrument. The gray-haired girl with red eyes looked at him hopefully as if he were a savior. After some time, Hans was already outside. He came out of the arch above which there is an owl. Hans and this girl stood at the northern entrance to the village of Calyx, on both sides of which there were guards. Hans looked at the sky and grinned. He turned around and looked at the girl he bought yesterday. He could see that she felt uncomfortable in his presence. The girl looked at Hans in disbelief as he reflected on the fact that she was only a temporary tool that could help him. Hans went and the girl followed him. They were both standing at the northern entrance to Calyx village. Hans looked at the cart leaving the village and said that they were here. Hans saw this flag and realized that this was the teeth of the Red Crocodile detachment. Their leader also went with them. Their leader is Gerbier, a bearded man holding a huge sword. Hans noticed this sword and thought that it was a huge scarlet sword. Looking to the side, Hans said that this sword was simply huge. Meanwhile, the girl watched this questioningly. The hero understood that by observing Gerbier, he received enough information. Even at this moment, the heroes become stronger. Hans looked after the departing cart and thought that knowing their list, he could easily find them. Hans then addressed the girl by name, whose name was Lemelin. Lemelin looked at him in surprise and answered. Hans looked at her and told her not to lag behind because they needed to speed up. In response to this, Lemelin nodded her head. Hans distanced himself from her and reflected that he did not expect much from this child. Turning his back to her and looking into the distance, Hans thought that her task was to distract the monsters in case of any problem. Meanwhile, black crows were flying around them. Lemelin was frightened at the sight of these ravens. Hans, meanwhile, was thinking that she was, in other words, just a bait. Lemelin ran after Hans, whose conscience suddenly awoke, and he thought that, probably, it would not be worth mocking her like that. After some time, they reached the right place, but it was dark outside, and skulls were scattered around the area, which made this place quite scary. Lemelin was horrified looking at this. Suddenly, Hans turned to her and ordered her to come to him. Hans took a test tube out of his pocket. Barefoot Lemelin approached Hans. However, he immediately sprayed the contents of the test tube in her face. Lemelin closed her eyes in fear and covered her face. Then she opened one eye and realized that nothing bad had happened. She looked at herself and asked in surprise what it was. Hans replied that this substance was prepared from the fruits of cardellum. Continuing to douse her with this dust, Hans said that it could temporarily mask her smell. Lemelin looked away and smiled and said that this was good. Hans understood that the action time was limited, but this way they could avoid meeting the monsters. Hans walked forward and grinned, thinking that they had better avoid trouble. There was a beautiful full moon in the sky. Hans and Lemelin walked along the alleys of a dilapidated building. Hans walked forward, putting his hand to his chin and thinking, while Lemelin looked around fearfully. Hans went up to the stairs and said in his thoughts that it was obvious that he was not going to help Gerbier. Hans climbed up the stairs and stopped, while Lemelin climbed up the stairs after him. Hans looked down and said that the only thing he could trust was the situation he was in, not the person. Hans knew that after seeing the deaths of the two heroes in whom he believed so much, he must take into account any options available to him. Meanwhile, skeletons walked on the ground. It turned out that Gerbier and the warriors of his clan were fighting a huge number of skeletons. It was dark outside. Skeletons walked everywhere and fought with the Gerbier clan. One of the skeletons was dragging some very heavy weapon behind it. Many skeletons stood over Gerbier's dead body, and in front of them stood some special skeleton from which a blue aura emanated. This skeleton in a cape and with heavy weapons is the same martyr thirsty for darkness, Hamel. Hans watched this from above and said that Gerbier would not cope either. Hans couldn't say for sure whether Gerbier was confused by what he saw or was as smart as a dried smelt, because he is not a game character, but probably the others are no different from him. Hans put his hand to his chin and said it was time to take matters into his own hands. Hans knelt down and said that it was time for Lemelin to act. He asked her if she remembered what he told her last time. Lemelin looked at him and asked excitedly if they were really going to do this. Hans looked at her seriously and asked if she really thought he was joking. Lemelin trembled and, looking away to the side, said intermittently that no. Hans stood up and reached for his bag. He instructed her to run as fast as she could if she valued her life, because that was the only way she could stay alive. Hans gave her some gold coins and told her that this was her payment for completing the task. She looked dumbfounded at the 5 gold coins and imagined that she could buy a lot of bread. Hans asked her if this was really not enough and she needed more, but Lemelin looked away and joyfully thought that this was a lot. Hans took a stick out of his bag and said that when burned, this stick emits a scent that attracts enemies. He ordered her to take this stick and run where he said. Hans hit the stick with a stone and a spark appeared. When the stick caught fire, Hans told Lemelin not to return to him after that, but to go away and live for her own pleasure. Lemelin looked at him annoyed and said about the agreement. He handed her the stick and told her that he had terminated her contract before they came here. She took the stick in her hands and looked at him in surprise. They both looked at the monsters. Hans said that he had no need to lie to her and she could check it herself later. He then ordered her to run. Lemelin looked down excitedly. Immediately she jumped down. As soon as Lemelin landed with a burning stick in her hands, the skeletons immediately turned their attention to her. She started waving the burning stick. Waving a stick, she shouted to the skeletons, and therefore she managed to attract their attention, and the skeletons turned around and looked in her direction. Hamel also drew attention to it. He extended his hand and pointed at her. The skeletons, on Gamel's orders, began to flee to Lemelin. The girl was very scared and ran away from the monsters, almost crying. She began to run into some dark alley, and the skeletons ran after her. Hans, meanwhile, was holding some kind of stone in his hands and thought that Lemelin was quick, and therefore the skeletons would not catch up with her. Hans swung his hand and threw a stone. The stone flew straight into Hamel's face. Hans hit Gamel in the head with a stone. Due to the impact, this stone turned red and began to glow. A moment later, there was an explosion right in front of Hamel's face. Hans went down and picked up the shield and said that there were 3 left. He looked ahead and said that he thought there would be at least 5 of them, but he knew better. Hans took out his sword and stood in a fighting stance, and 3 skeletons stood in front of him. Lemelina, meanwhile, continued to run, holding a burning stick in her hands. She ran barefoot across the stone floor. Suddenly, 2 skeletons with spears appeared in front of Lemelin, but she did not stop. She remembered Hans telling her not to think and just run straight north. Continuing to run with a stick in her hands, she thought that the skeletons would not be able to run after her after crossing the northern gate. With ease, she ran past several skeletons with weapons. A moment later, she saw the same northern gate in front of her. She ran out of the gate, but the skeletons were no longer chasing her. Lemelin turned around in fear and exclaimed that she had succeeded. She looked at the gate and noticed that the skeletons were no longer chasing. Everything was just as Hans said. Suddenly, she was surprised by something. She began to think that the red seal meant that the owner of this seal was an indentured servant. A servant can be used as a tool or a toy and then abandoned. She lowered her jacket and saw that there was no red seal on it. Her hand began to tremble and Lemelin said that she had fallen for it and was just bait. Having fallen to the ground, Lemelin trembled and thought that it seemed to her that she would die here. The flushed Lemelin began to cry and said in a trembling voice that Hans had not lied. Looking at the burning torch, Lemelin was glad that she was now free. Hans, meanwhile, was fighting with the skeletons and one of them had already managed to get close to him. Hans blocked the skeleton's attack with his shield, after which he deftly pierced him through with his sword. Looking at the two remaining skeletons, Hans realized that he was now holding Paval's favorite dagger in his hands. Throwing the dagger with all his strength, Hans thought that Paval's throwing skills were simply incredible. The dagger pierced right through the skeleton's head, breaking through his helmet. However, the skeleton continued to stand, even though the hilt of the sword was sticking out of its mouth. The skeleton began to attack Hans again, but he understood that even though the throw was not strong enough, it would do. Both remaining skeletons ran towards Hans. Heroes took Gerbier's sword in his hands and thought that a second would be enough for him to delay the skeleton. And so Hans raised Gerbier's sword, and behind him a projection of this same Gerbier appeared, personifying the fact that Hans had received his skills. The hero said that the time has come for the classic, a two-handed sword. Hans swung his new huge two-handed sword, and the skeleton with a dagger in his head rushed to attack. The hero hit and cut the skeleton in half. Hans stopped and thought that it was easy for him, as if he were swinging an ordinary sword. Hans wondered if he had also adopted Gerbier's physical abilities. Behind Hans was a skeleton who had already pointed a spear at him. Hans immediately ducked and the spear passed by. Hans struck back and cut off the skeleton's hand. The hero looked at him and said that he was done with this little thing. He looked at Hamel and said that now it was time to deal with this monster. It was still dark outside and only the moon illuminated the ground. Hamel hit Hans with his heavy hammer, but the hero managed to jump to the side. Hans reflected that he had taken care of the small skeletons summoned by Hamel, but that was only half the battle because the problem lay in his strong body and recovery speed. Hans ran forward, trusting that the strength he had gained would be enough. Hans realized that it would be difficult to get close to Hamel since he was swinging this huge thing so recklessly. The hero turned around and decided that he needed to be stopped. Hamel swung his huge hammer. Hans held out a huge sword in front of him, realizing that he would not be able to dodge. Hamel's blow hit the sword directly and the sword began to crack. The sword broke and Hamel hit Hans right in the torso with a huge hammer. From such a strong blow, Hans flew back. He tried to stand up, leaning on the broken sword, but his body was shaking. Hamel swung his hammer again and rushed to attack. Hamel hit him, but Hans managed to put up a shield in front of him. The force of the blow was so great that Hans flew into the stone wall and destroyed it. He fell to the ground, his body trembling. Hans's gaze became clouded and his hands were shaking violently. Hans started coughing up blood. Hans's mask was stained with blood. He thought that with his frail body he might die. He looked at the fragment of the sword and realized that Gerbier's sword could no longer be used. Hans began to take off his helmet and asked himself what he was doing. Hans threw the helmet on the floor and said that he was obsessed with these abilities like crazy. He grabbed his neck and spat out some blood. The hero said that the weapon was broken and the body was not in the best shape. Hans stretched his neck and closed his eyes, resigned himself to it and said that he didn't care. His gaze was extremely serious and the yellow aura around him intensified. Hans said that from now on he would follow his original plan to destroy Hamel, and so they stood in front of each other face to face. There was no one alive around except Hans and Hamel. The hero ran forward, holding only a shield in his hands. A dark aura appeared around Hamel and he swung his huge hammer to make an attack. Continuing to approach the monster, Hans realized that every attack was dangerous. Suddenly Hans stopped. He raised his hand to throw the stone he was holding in his hand. Hans threw this stone straight at Hamel. He hoped that he could throw Hamel off balance. Hans threw an explosive stone right at Hamel's feet. There was an explosion that knocked Hamel off balance. Hans stuck his hand into the bag and said that this power would be useless. He took a bottle out of his bag. Hans threw the bottle at Hamel. The bottle broke as it flew towards Hamel and some liquid poured out of it. This liquid corroded Hamel's hand. Because of this, the monster dropped his hammer because he now has no arm. Hamel looked in surprise at his bones sticking out from under his clothes. Hans picked up the chain and asked Hamel if he liked it. Hans began to unwind this chain and said that he had saved this holy water especially for Hamel. He swung the chain and said that holy water was very effective against undead creatures like Hamel. Hans began to wrap the chain around Hamel's neck. Hans began to pull the chain, thinking that Hamel's core was in his head. Hans jumped right above the monster. He sat on his neck and began to pull the chain even harder, realizing that if he broke the core, Hamel would die. Hans took out another bottle of holy water from his bag. He broke this bottle of holy water right on Hamel's head. The monster began to scream and a blue core glow began to emanate from its mouth. The holy water began to corrode Hamel's skull. However, his wounds regenerated very quickly. Hans knew that the wound would heal quickly because it was close to his heart. Hans looked down and said that he had prepared for this too. Hans took out another bottle of holy water and, opening it, said that he had a lot of money, so he bought holy water especially for Hamel. Hans began to pour holy water on Hamel. He stuck the neck of the bottle directly into Hamel's wound, which had not yet fully regenerated. Hamel began to scream, and holy water began to flow from his eyes and mouth. Hamel tried to grab Hans, but the hero covered himself with a shield. Hans said that it did help him after all. Holding a chain in his hands and covering himself with a shield, Hans said that it was not as useless as it seemed. The hero again reached into the bag to take something out of it. He took out another bottle of holy water and, opening it with his teeth, mumbled that it was time to finish with Hamel. He stuck the neck of the bottle into Hamel's eye and began pouring holy water onto it. After some time, Hamel was lying on the floor and Hans was sitting next to him. Hamel was no longer moving, which meant he was dead. Hans lowered his head and said with annoyance that last time he fought just as hard, but he did not understand why this was all happening to him. He remembered the three heroes and said that he just wanted to help them. Hans just wanted to live in peace and quiet. Hans lowered his head and said with annoyance that now he didn't even know what to think. Suddenly he heard some sounds and looked to the side. A frightened and trembling Lemelin approached him, holding his helmet in her hands. After some time, Hans was already wandering through the desert. Hans looked at the sunset and grumbled. He looked at his wound and said that after every fight it was the same. Suddenly he looked sharply displeased at someone behind. He looked at Lemelin and ordered her to take off her helmet. Lemelin took off her helmet and looked away. She took the helmet in her hands and looked at Hans with a smile while he continued to grumble and sigh languidly. Hans wondered how it had come to this. The action shifts again to the night when Hans fought against Hamel. Lemelin walked through that abandoned place where skeletons live. Hans was angry with her and asked why she came back because he had previously told her that the contract was broken. Suddenly Hans coughed up blood and Lemelin got scared. She saw that there was a wound on his stomach. She looked at this with pity and thought that Hans was wounded and needed help. She placed Hans's bag and helmet on the floor. Lemelin provided first aid to the hero and bandaged him, after which Hans put his cape back on. He turned around and thanked her for healing him, but he said she was now free to go. Lemelin pressed her hands to her chest and shook her head. He looked at her questioningly. Hans embarrassed Lemelin by taking out a bag of gold, because he thought that she wanted more money. Lemelin started shaking her head again. Hans asked if she wanted anything else. Lemelin stopped and looked at him, but she was still silent. Then she shook her head again. Hans looked at her calmly. However, then he became very angry because she did not tell him what she needed. After some time they walked past a rocky area. Suddenly Hans sped up. Lemelin looked after him as he ran as fast as he could. After some time, Hans reached the forest, but Lemelin still found him. Hans looked at her with anger, but her gaze was as calm as possible. When they stopped to recuperate, Lemelin constantly held onto his cloak. Hans sat by the fire while Lemelin lay next to him, holding onto his cloak. Lemelin slept peacefully while Hans was nearby. They continued to walk somewhere while a flock of birds flew over them. The hero stopped near the sign and said that they were going to the Alban Citadel. Looking at the sign with the path leading to the Citadel, Hans thought that the first destination was Malik Castle, but Hans decided to stop at the Citadel to learn more about the situation. Hans turned his gaze to Lemelin and thought that everything would become more complicated if she went with him. Hans squinted his eyes with displeasure and said in his thoughts that now Lemelin is just a burden. The hero turned around and said that he would ask her again. Hans asked her why she followed him around, because he freed her. Lemelin lowered her head and said with annoyance that she just wanted to stay with the master. The hero looked at her with confusion and asked why she wanted this, because he did nothing to her. Lemelin replied that this was the reason. She hugged Hans' helmet even tighter and said that he didn't hit her or hurt her. She wanted to say something else, but suddenly she blushed and lowered her head. Blushing and crying, Lemelin said that she did not want to die. Silence reigned. There was no one around them because they were standing in a deserted area. Hans asked her that she really thought that she would live longer if she stayed with him. Holding his wound, he asked if she could see the state he was in now. The reddened Lemelin lowered her eyes and said that she would die much faster alone. Holding his side and looking at her with pity, Hans said that was why he gave her a few gold pieces. Lemelin turned away and began to say that she was really grateful to him, but in the end, someone would still steal this money. Hans frowned and called her thoughtless. Lemelin felt ashamed and stared at one point. Hans thought that he knew this, but left everything as it was since he was not responsible for her. He would like to save his own life, but he cannot guarantee its safety. Lemelin cried and looked pitifully at Hans while he thought that she probably guessed this, but still the safest option for her was to stay next to him. Then Hans began to think that she was not an ordinary person, but a piebald. The hero understood that she could easily be caught and again sent captive to the merchants. After all, the demand for piebalds is high for many reasons. Hans looked at the embarrassed Lemelin, who lowered her eyes and thought that last time she was an excellent bait, but he didn't need anything more from her. Hans turned silently and walked on. Lemelin looked questioningly at Hans. Moving on, Hans told her to keep the helmet safe. He also promised that he would kill her himself if she lost her helmet. Lemelin blushed and was surprised. She smiled and happily said that it was good. After a while they reached the Citadel. Hans thought that if his memory served him right, soon some event would take place in the alien Citadel. It was night outside. The action took place in the Alban Citadel. There were a lot of people wandering the streets of the Citadel, and a man in a cape especially stood out among them. This man came to the potion shop. He walked up to the counter and asked the salesman when his commission would be calculated. The saleswoman put her hand on the counter and said that the man was not patient. The blonde girl looked at him and asked him how many times she should repeat. She asked him this question because before that she told him that the ashes of the dead were needed. Turning around and looking contemptuously, the girl in the red cape said that the man had already heard many times that she was the only chemist who could cure that hand. She pulled the corner of her mouth and told the man to smile because life is beautiful and a smile should shine on his beautiful face. The red-haired man in the cape angrily said that she talks too much and also called her names. It turned out that this man is Flop. He reached for the weapon in his belt and asked her if she wanted him to shorten her tongue. The action was still taking place in the potion shop. The fair-haired girl thought that this non-entity had an unpleasant character, despite his small face. Suddenly the door to the store opened and the saleswoman wondered in surprise whether this was really a new visitor. Hans and Lemelin entered the store. Hans said that he needed to buy elixirs for recovery. The saleswoman looked at him and said that there were elixirs, but they were new. She also added that she had never met Hans before. The hero replied that he had only arrived today. The saleswoman immediately became interested and began to beam, but Hans looked unhappy and gloomy. The girl asked him where he came from and how he knew that she was selling elixirs. Holding his side, Hans looked at her silently while she asked many questions. Hans got angry and looked away because the saleswoman asked him what he thought about her. He looked at her gloomily and asked if it was really that important. The saleswoman, putting her hand on the chair, said that this was not so at all. Hans stood at the counter while the saleswoman packed the potions. Lemelin, meanwhile, was looking with interest at something in the store. The saleswoman opened some kind of wooden box. It was a box containing potions. The girl took one bottle and asked Hans how much he needed. The girl picked up one red bottle and Hans said that he needed 10 of them. She asked if Hans knew that her potions were quite expensive. Looking at the box of potions, Hans said that the price does not matter. Besides, according to him, he knows their value and therefore he will pay back properly. The saleswoman put her hand to her chin and smiled, asking him if he really had 10 gold coins. Hans immediately told her to give him 15 bottles. The saleswoman looked at him in surprise because she did not expect him to take 15 bottles at once. Hans smiled and repeated that he had told her to give him 15 bottles because only those prepared by her were effective. Hans smiled slyly and thought that even if this ends in loss, nothing can be done. Hans put gold coins on the table. The saleswoman placed a wooden box of potions in front of him. Hans, standing in front of her, thought that she could tell him valuable information when they became close. Hans then decided that he could also benefit by arousing her interest as an alchemist. The hero turned to Lemelin and instructed her to give that thing back from Hamel. Lemelin walked up to the counter and put some kind of bag on the table. The bag contained some kind of ashes, which also emitted a dark aura. The saleswoman blushed and, putting her hand to her chin, asked if these were really the ashes of the dead. Hans knew that her touching her chin was a sign that they were getting closer. Hans picked up one bottle, thinking that everything was happening faster than he thought. The alchemist showed him 3 fingers and said that with this she could make 3 more potions. Then she looked at him intently and smilingly said that she could do even more, but the price would be higher, and therefore she asked him if he agreed to such conditions. Before drinking the potion, Hans said that he didn't care. The potion took effect and Hans opened his eyes wide in surprise. He looked at the potion with annoyance and said that it tasted disgusting and he didn't want to drink it anymore. However, Hans extended his hand in front of him and said that the elixir was indeed effective. The alchemist turned around and asked him if he really was hanging around with this girl because she was his servant. Hans pointed at her and asked if she wanted to take it too. Lemelin was upset and looked away. The alchemist smiled and said that she had to refuse because Lemelin seemed to like Hans. Hans looked at Lemelin and, putting his hand to his chin, said that the alchemist was mistaken because he and Lemelin had known each other for less than a week. Turning around, the saleswoman said that in fact it is not so important how long ago they met each other because life is fleeting, but fate is eternal. After some time, Hans and Lemelin wandered around the Citadel. They entered a building and began to climb up the stairs. They came out to some hill of the fortress and a wonderful landscape opened up to them. Looking at this, Hans suddenly remembered what was about to happen. Lemelin was delighted with the beauty of this landscape. However, Hans was emotionless and said that the army of monsters would arrive here in a week. Lemelin turned around and looked at him in shock. Hans remembered that in the original game this place was defended by Gerbier, and now that Gerbier is dead, no one can help the residents, which means they are vulnerable. Hans furrowed his eyebrows and thought that this was why he had come here. The hero calmly looked into the distance while his cloak fluttered in the wind, and he himself thought that he wanted to see how the Citadel would defend itself without the help of heroes. Some time passed, it was dark outside. The action takes place in a bar. Some hunter stood up and, raising his glass, shouted to the whole hall that he would be the #1 hunter in history. Another hunter, the one with the scar, pointed a finger at himself and boasted that he had recently captured a witch successor. A long-haired man sitting nearby turned around and asked Cornell if she even existed. Cornell got angry and shouted that she was real. Then they began to clash because the long-haired man said that Cornell was just a liar. Hans sat in the same bar and watched with displeasure as they clashed and argued. Suddenly a man hit the table with all his might with a wooden mug. Even the waiter was scared because the man in the dark cape called these men names and said that they were too noisy. Cornell frowned and, calling him one-armed, asked what he had just blurted out. Cornell hugged Flop and showed him his fist. Flop once again said that they were too noisy. Flop suddenly got angry and hit him in the face. Taking hold of the sword, Flop said that if he really wanted a fight, then let him attack. Lemelin stood up from the table and excitedly asked Hans if he was sure they could stay here. She took hold of her cape and, looking away, said that several days had already passed. Hans, while enjoying his meal, asked Lemelin not to ask unnecessary questions. He looked at her and, pointing his finger at the plate, asked her to sit down and eat. Looking at the food and admiring it, Lemelin asked if she really could, since servants were not allowed to do this. Hans looked away and once again told her to just sit down and eat. Lemelin looked very happy and thanked Hans. She then took the skewer and began happily enjoying the food. Hans began to think that the upcoming event, the Spirit of the Fallen Empire, would be much worse than expected. Hans understood that elite spirit knights were the same in strength as heroes. Even their gloomy appearance is frightening. Then Hans remembered their rookie commander, who rode a horse. The name of their commander is Ryok Schulin. The hero knew that if the Citadel collapsed because of them, the game would be over. Holding a skewer stick in his mouth, Hans thought that he must protect this place in order to prevent the end. The heroes must have wandered here during their journey, but they are all dead. And now the moment has come again when Hans looks displeasedly at the conflicting men and says that this is a clownery. The flop hit Cornell and sent him flying. Hans drank his drink and looked at the trembling Lemelin and asked her if she was afraid. At the same time, he was upset that he had to defend this place along with people like those who just started a fight in the bar. Ignoring the fight, Hans took a sip and resigned himself to the fact that he had no choice. He decided to continue looking for other heroes. Flop, meanwhile, continued to fight and this time hit the long-haired man. Hans, who had had too much to drink, closed his eyes and decided that he could look for tools instead, since that was what they had come to the Citadel for. Lemelin was shocked because the wooden mug flew straight into Hans' head. She asked Hans in fear if he was okay, but Hans' aura had already begun to intensify. An angry Hans exhaled steam and said how bored he was. He immediately asked Lemelin to give him the helmet. As Hans put on his helmet, he assumed that Lemelin probably thought that he had come to the tavern just to drink. But in reality, Hans was training. The hero approached one of the men and poked his finger at his shoulder. Hans was honing his sword skills for the upcoming battle, but he could not use all the powers he had acquired at once. Hans grabbed the man by his jacket and the man turned around. Hans thought that he could not continue to act, relying only on the help of the forces of dead heroes. The man was shocked because Hans swung his fist at him. A moment later, Hans punched the man in the face. The man fell to the floor and Flop noticed this. The man was passed out. Hans, meanwhile, was thinking that he was not sure what he needed to do to become stronger. Flop looked at Hans, who grinned and said that he knocked out this man with one blow without even warming up. Flop made an arrogant face and asked Hans what he was like. The hero looked at him carefully and realized that this red-haired boy was from the village of Aram. Suddenly, Hans opened his eyes wide in surprise. He saw some memory of his character. Hans stood opposite Flop, and behind them lay the body of a dead gray-haired girl. Hans asked Flop what he thought. The strong survive or those who survive are strong? Flop exclaimed that of course the fittest survive. Then Hans wondered if they were strong. Everything around turned red. Hans turned around in horror. The Flop said they weren't strong. A huge monster appeared behind Hans. Flop said they were just lucky that day. Some hunter jumped on the monster. Having made an incredibly powerful blow, this hunter killed the monster and saved Flop and Hans. The hero covered his face with his hand and said that he did not need these memories. Throwing his sword over his shoulder, Flop asked Hans what he had said. However, Hans turned around and began to walk away, realizing that his body remembered Flop. He then turned to Lemelin and ordered her to go. Hans opened the door and started to go out when suddenly something caught Flop's attention. He looked carefully at Lemelin, who had just turned around and looked at him before leaving. The girl seemed familiar to him. He remembered a girl who looked a lot like her. Flop extended his hand and asked hopefully if it was Elaine. However, Flop's gaze darkened and he said that this could not be because Elaine was dead. Some time passed and Hans came to the blacksmith. There were many metal objects such as helmets and swords lying around in the blacksmith's workshop. Hans asked Lemelin if she knew how to use a sword. Lemelin looked confused and said that she could, but only a little. Taking the sword in his hands, Hans asked if she was doing well, but Lemelin immediately answered negatively. Hans put his hand to his chin and asked her about the bow, but Lemelin replied that she had never tried to shoot with one. Hans looked at her with annoyance and said that this meant that she could not do anything. Lemelin lowered her head and apologized, but Hans said it was okay. The hero put his hand to his chin and, taking out a small dagger, said that this was better than lying about his skills. He then turned around and looked at the weapon stand. He took a crossbow from there. Hans tossed her a crossbow and told her to try shooting with it. Holding the crossbow in her hands, Lemelin said in confusion that she had never used it, but Hans told her to keep the crossbow for now. Suddenly Hans smiled slyly. However, his smile changed to a more benevolent one and he asked her not to worry because she would learn from her own experience. After some time, Hans and Lemelin came to the field in beautiful sunny weather. Hans reflected on the fact that in this world some races are despised and not recognized. One of these races is the Pibalds, one of which is Lemelin. Pibalds can be recognized by their silvery hair. Their characteristics are not very well known to people. Lemelin began training to shoot a crossbow. Hans knew that Pibalds had a fighting instinct and learned 100 times faster than others. After some time, Lemelin learned to hit the target directly with a crossbow. Lemelin was delighted and let out a joyful cry. Looking at the target, Hans told Lemelin that it was easier to master a crossbow than a bow and arrow, but she would still have to train for weeks. Hans, meanwhile, sat at the table and wondered how Lemelin learned to shoot perfectly at a target in just a couple of hours, but he immediately understood this, remembering that she was Piebald. Hans poured holy water into some container and thought that Lemelin still had one drawback. He understood that Lemelin's skill was not as good as Paval's. After all, Paval's ability allowed him to hit a target at any distance. A projection of a joyful pulse showing a thumbs up appeared in the sky. Lemelin looked at the sky while Hans thought that Lemelin was no match for Paval. Hans turned around and waved to her. Lemelin immediately approached the hero. He reached for some kind of bag. Hans gave her the bag and asked her to try on what he bought. Lemelin looked at this bag joyfully. Hans looked at her with a smile and thought that she should not look like a servant during the battle because this was an important part of their operation. Day 0 has arrived. Hans stood and took some nets off the hanger, looking into the distance in which something gloomy was already visible. Hans thought that they had prepared everything in the last week. The hero saw that the clouds were gathering and confidently said that the enemies were here. He ordered Lemelin to go and she immediately responded. Lemelin also took some kind of backpack. They began to walk towards the Citadel. Along the way, Hans thought that he knew this world better than anyone. Therefore, he knows for sure that in the world of Banta there is no such thing as luck. Hans put on the helmet and said in his thoughts that they could only become stronger through experience and hard work. Following Hans was Lemelin, dressed in her new equipment and carrying a huge backpack on her back. Hans and Lemelin walked side by side straight to the place where the clouds were thickening and darkening. Lemelin asked if Hans was worried, but he replied that he was not at all. In his thoughts, Hans said that he had experienced this himself 1,000 times. During this time, while they were preparing, Lemelin learned to hit the target perfectly, and therefore the target was littered with arrows. The guards stood and looked down from the fortress. One of the guards began ringing the bell and shouting for the archers to get into position. Many warriors began to climb up the fortress. The archers took up positions and filled the fortress. The bald man clenched his fist and shouted that the time had come. Then several more warriors approached them and exclaimed that it had finally happened. Among the warriors stood Flop, as well as Cornell, who said that he was already bored. Flop looked at Hans and Lemelin. Flop said that this was the guy and girl with silver hair that the alchemist told him about. Flop clenched his fist and said he would thank him later. Meanwhile, an army of elite spirit knights appeared on the horizon. They carried with them a banner depicting a sword with wings. In front of them stood their commander, Ryok Schulin. He was distinguished from the others by his cape and helmet of a different shape. Ryok shouted and asked if they could hear him. He stuck the banner into the ground and a dark aura began to emanate from it. Hans, holding a bow in his hands, called them savages. Ryok, angry, asked Hans how he dared say such a thing. Hans stood calmly and looked at them while everyone behind him trembled in fear. Ryok shouted and warned them not to dare to capture their beautiful citadel because the endless sky was watching them. Hans picked up the arrow and a yellow aura appeared around him. He asked if they were afraid of divine punishment. Immediately, Ryok asked if they were afraid of divine punishment. A projection of Paval appeared behind Hans, representing him using his skill. The hero picked up a bow and arrows and said that he was no longer going to listen to this. Hans looked at Ryok and thought that as long as he saw him, he could shoot him. Hans pulled the bowstring, realizing that the shot would be the best, and this was not an exaggeration at all, but Paval's skill. Hans released the bowstring and the arrow flew out. She pierced the head of one of the elite spirit knights. This arrow blew the spirit knight's head into pieces. The hunters looked at this in surprise. The guards were shocked and silently looked at Hans. Lemelin turned to Hans in fear. All eyes were focused on Hans, who stood on the ledge. Hans turned around and asked Lemelin why she turned to him. The hero thought that skipping cutscenes was normal. The clouds continued to thicken and darken. Ryok, standing below, gazed at Hans, who stood on the ledge. A dark purple aura began to emanate from Ryok and he exclaimed that Hans had no respect. The guards began to rejoice and shout that one hit, one skill. The bald hunter grabbed his sword and said that they were weaker than they seemed. He shouted joyfully that they would send their enemies back to their graves. As the guards cheered, Hans looked at them and realized that without holy water nothing would work, but in Hans' opinion, they didn't need to know that. Hans headed somewhere and ordered Lemelin to keep up with him. Lemelin looked questioningly at Hans, because after some time he said that they were almost there. For some reason Hans thought about a signal flare signaling the start of war. At the same moment, fire appeared in the sky. Lemelin looked in the direction where the bright light came from. Seeing this, Lemelin was shocked. Hans and Lemelin were walking towards a door. Meanwhile, the guards watched with excitement what was happening. A huge fireball flew straight towards the fortress, where many guards were still standing. The fireball hit the fortress and destroyed it, creating a large explosion. Some of the spirit knights stood on the ground with their hands raised to use magic. Ryok Schulin held out his axe and gave orders to his subordinates to begin the attack. Flop covered his face with his hand to protect himself from stones flying in different directions due to the explosion. The fortress was destroyed. Many guards stood ready right in the center. They looked at the wall and shouted that it was broken. The knight in iron armor shouted for everyone to prepare for battle. He ordered the archers to aim at the magos on the back line, and they immediately began to carry out his order, taking aim with their bows. Cornell, holding a spear in his hands, happily said that it was time to get to work. He also said that they would receive 20 silver coins for each and become rich. Meanwhile, a man shouted in horror that they would all die and that he wanted to leave. The man began to run and turned around and shouted that he was not going to die here. The bald man and Cornell looked at him and wondered if this disgrace really called himself a mercenary. Suddenly someone said that running away to survive is a smart decision. Flop looked away and added that he did not know whether this hunter would be saved. The two men stood behind Flop, talking to each other. The bald man asked if they would get out of here alive. Cornell replied that he was not sure, but they could not know that a hero would suddenly appear to save them. Fireballs continued to destroy the fortress. Elite spirit knights cut off the heads of hunters. The hunter's severed head fell to the ground. Another spirit knight also killed a man by piercing him with a sword. Many hunters fought, but they lost. Cornell was also attacked by the enemy. Cornell was quite strong, and therefore he managed to pierce the enemy with his spear. The spirit knight seemed to evaporate, leaving a cloud of dark energy in the air. Cornell lowered his head and said in horror that he would die here. Cornell took the spear and looked to the side. He said that he has always been confident in his abilities, but they are different from other monsters. Cornell turned around and said he was wondering how the others were doing. He saw a comrade who had just defeated one of the monsters. Cornell's comrade plucked up courage and resolutely shouted that they would not die here. He grabbed the sword with both hands and shouted furiously that otherwise these monsters would come for the souls of their loved ones. The bald man lunged towards the monster and shouted to the other hunters to fight for their families. He cut the monster. The bald man smiled and said that they would manage. Suddenly a stronger monster appeared behind him and said that this bald man was talking too much. The monster immediately cut off his head. The monster struck with his sword so quickly that the man's head flew off his shoulders in an instant. The monster pulled his sword in front of him and said that the invaders must die. Then he looked at the other hunter and added that every single one of them should die. Cornell was horrified. The monster began to approach Cornell with incredible speed. However, the man held out his spear in front of him, not intending to run away. Cornell struck with his spear, but the monster immediately made another dash and ended up behind him. Cornell looked at this and realized that his life was about to end. Just at that moment, someone, sitting on a horse, approached them. The horse Hans was riding jumped into the air. The monster and Cornell looked up. Cornell was surprised, and the monster was terrified. The horse hit the monster's face with its hoof. Then she trampled him. The horse Hans was riding was black. The monster evaporated, leaving purple dark energy behind. Hans looked at Cornell and asked if he was okay. The man confirmed this with a trembling voice. Hans turned around and said it was wonderful. Hans began to move on, but not before ordering Cornell to return to the others and tell them to retreat. He told Lemelin that they would continue to move on, to which the girl agreed with a smile. Cornell extended his hand in shock, as if he recognized Hans. He continued to watch them for some time. Hans rode away on horseback. Two monsters stood in front of them. Hans, without slowing down, said that they would break through the monsters. He understood that they must kill hundreds in spirit to end this siege. Hans held a spear in his hand, and Lemelin began to kill the spirits with a bow. The yellow aura around Hans intensified, and he said that he had no time for these spirits. Hans started slashing at the monsters, thinking it was time to fight the final boss. They easily overcame the obstacle in the form of spirits, because Hans cut them down right on the move. Hans rode on horseback to a ruined wall, near which stood many spirits. Cornell, looking at him, said that this guy is not afraid of death, just like a hero. Hans and Lemelin were on horseback moving towards the destroyed wall. They were in combat readiness. The spirits immediately began to attack them, but Hans did not slow down. Hans thought that judging by their movements, each of the spirits was elite. The elite spirits had different masks as well as different equipment. However, they have little intelligence. The yellow aura around Hans intensified. Hans understood that his advantage was horsemanship. He also realized that he could combine this art with the spear art of Cadiz and obtain the art of spear and horsemanship. Hans looked intimidating, with an aura raging around him as he rode on a black horse. Hans broke through the monsters by simply cutting them apart with his spear. There were still a lot of opponents in front of Hans, but he galloped straight towards them. Ryok looked at Hans and said that it was funny that someone dared to break in on them. Ryok raised his axe and commanded the spirits to approach him. Ryok hit the ground with his axe handle and dark energy appeared. This dark energy enveloped the spirits in front. Hans pulled the leash to stop the horse. The horse stopped and stood on its hind legs. The spirits suddenly began to disperse. Lemelin looked at this in surprise and said that the way was open. The spirits dispersed and cleared the way. Ryok stood in the distance, pointing his axe at Hans. Lemelin was shocked because Hans turned around and ordered her to get off the horse. He looked at the spirits and said that everything was fine, because the spirits would not attack her. Lemelin began to dismount from the horse. Suddenly Ryok asked Hans if he had really come all the way here alone. Hans looked at Lemelin and said that this was not entirely true. Ryok pointed his finger at Hans and asked why Hans was here. Suddenly the spirit knights began to move. All these spirits surrounded Hans and Lemelin, pointing their weapons at them. The girl was shocked and turned to Hans. The hero reached for her backpack and calmed her down. He took out some paper from there and threw it towards Ryok. The paper fell at Rydok's feet and he turned his attention to it. Ryok looked at the elite spirit knight standing behind him. The spirit knight lowered his head. He bent down to pick up what Hans had thrown at him from the floor. Ryok took it and said it was the family knight's coat of arms. Ryok asked if Hans was one of them. The hero replied that it was so. Hans threw the crest towards Ryok, because this is the traditional way for knights to challenge each other to a duel. Hans understood that Ryok was a knight who put honor above all else. Knight, captain of the fallen empire, Ryok Schulin. Ryok clenched his fist and grinned and said that in this era, some old customs still persist. He also added that honor is not just a word. Hans looked at him and thought that this coat of arms was a fake, which he came up with in a hurry, but Ryok would not be able to check whether Hans was lying. The hero waved his hand and said that although Ryok had become a vengeful spirit, Hans had heard that Ryok was a knight with an honor incomparable to others. He looked at Ryok and shouted that he was challenging him to a duel. All this happened under the cover of darkness. The clouds were darker than ever. Hans and Ryok stood in front of each other, and the spirit knights crowded around them. Lemelin watched all this in horror. However, Hans closely monitored the situation and wondered why Ryok was silent. Perhaps he would not accept the challenge to a duel. Hans grabbed the reins tighter, wondering if it was time for him to run away. Ryok started shouting that Hans is a knight who knows what honor is in such a nasty time, which is quite funny. Ryok held out his axe and asked if the piebald woman next to Hans was a servant. Lemelin noticed this because Ryok pointed the axe at her. Hans looked at Lemelin and said that was true. Ryok said that then the world would know about Hans' knightly prowess, even if Hans was destined to fall here. Lemelin was scared, because Ryok said that since Lemelin was Hans' servant, he would appoint her as a witness to the duel between them. Hans agreed with this, while at the same time thinking that Rydok's words were a guarantee that Lemelin would not be hurt during their duel. Hans knew that everything had gone according to plan so far, but the hardest part hadn't even begun yet. Ryok raised his axe and exclaimed that a knight would never shy away from battle, and therefore Ryok accepted Han's challenge. Ryok was sitting astride a black horse that had a terrifying red aura emanating from it, whose name is Albros. Ryok swung his axe and mounted his horse again. He held out an axe and said that he, the captain of the Order of the Knights of the Son of the Bahan Empire, Ryok Schulin. He asked Hans what his name was. The hero replied that his name was Evan. Ryok pointed his axe at Hans and wished that their noble duel would go down in history. Hans, sitting on his horse, turned to Lemelin and ordered her to stay behind him. Lemelin began to object, but Hans reminded her that he told her not to dispute his words. Lemelin put her hand to her chest and asked him to be careful. Ryok Schulin shouted that the duel was beginning. Hans reflected on how all the bosses he had encountered before had the same attack pattern as in the game. Thanks to this, he was able to defeat wolfkin. He also defeated the Minotaur, knowing the location of his heart. Hans managed to defeat Anthro, and also Hamel. Ryok is no exception. Hans began to move towards him, thinking that there was no point in hesitating. Confidently holding the sword in his hands and galloping towards Ryok, Hans thought that he would simply meet him face to face. Ryok stood still and spoke about how Knight Evan seemed to forget who his opponent was, attacking head-on. Ryok's mask began to glow even more and he said that he would answer Hans's challenge with greater force. Ryok swung his axe. He threw the axe over his shoulder. Hans looked at this and realized that Rydok's fighting stance had changed to berserk mode. It was still night outside. Lemelin stood near the spirit knights. She was scared because the atmosphere had become so oppressive. He wondered if something had gone wrong. Hans stopped and his horse stood on its hind legs. Hans was confused. He wondered what was happening because he did not expect this. Hans also wondered why the berserker mode. Berserker mode instantly increases Rydok's combat power when he is in critical condition. However, it can be deactivated by killing Rydok's horse. Hans looked at him and calmed himself down, saying in his thoughts that nothing had changed and that he just needed to kill his horse. They stood opposite each other in a large arena. Hans wondered if he could fight Rydok. Rydok, meanwhile, looked at Hans and wondered if Hans was not going to attack. Rydok extended his clenched fist and exclaimed that then he would attack first. With incredible speed, Rydok rushed from his spot and quickly approached Hans. The hero just began to swing his spear. Rydok raised his axe and swung. Rydok struck with an axe, but Hans ducked down and repelled the attack, because he already knew the pattern of his attack even in this state. Hans extended his spear to the side. He thought that Cadiz had a special ability. He could channel the enemy's power to knock him out, but for it to activate, Hans had to repel the attack at least once. Rydok swung his axe again and told Hans to die with honor. He began to carry out an attack. Hans held his spear in front of him to defend himself. The axe hit the spear and sparks appeared. Holding back the onslaught of the attack with his spear, Hans decided that he needed to redirect this energy. Hans turned his spear and managed to repel Rydok's attack. Rydok extended his axe hand to the side. Hans looked at Rydok and said that was great, wondering if Rydok had lost his balance. Rydok dragged the axe behind him along the ground. However, Rydok's horse was still standing. Hans wondered how Rydok was able to survive. Hans lowered his head and said that he knew Rydok was an amazing rider. The hero grinned and blamed the game for this, because in the game Rydok had never handled this ability so easily. Rydok threw his axe over his shoulder and started laughing at Hans. He asked if Hans was going to cry now. The hero looked at him and wondered if Rydok was deliberately trying to make Hans emotional. In his thoughts, Hans told Rydok to just wait, because Hans would make him regret it. Rydok and Hans continued to fight each other. Hans struck with his spear, but Rydok also attacked and they repelled each other's attacks. Swinging his axe, Rydok laughed and shouted that Hans was doing a good job. With another attack, Rydok injured Hans' forearm. The hero thought about it and began to say that he would not achieve anything with defense alone. He added that every chance to attack should be taken, but because of this horse, Hans could not get close to him. Rydok began to approach Hans on horseback. He indignantly asked that Hans really had time to think. Rydok swung his axe at Hans and hit him. Hans's horse began to gallop without stopping. There was a wound on Hans' side. However, despite this, he moved forward with a spear at the ready. Suddenly, something caught Hans' attention. He saw that the red aura around Rydok began to intensify. The hero stopped and thought that Rydok was clearly worried. Rydok shouted for Hans to die. However, the hero immediately pulled the horse's bridle and decided that he would not die here. Hans's horse bumped into Rydok's horse while the hero was squatting on it, preparing for something. Rydok extended his hand forward. Hans jumped into the air as a yellow aura appeared around him. Rydok launched an attack with his axe. Something flew straight at Hans, and meanwhile the hero said that one of Cadiz's skills in the game is receiving bonuses when colliding with aggressive opponents. Hans dodged, moving to the side. The hero took out his spear and his aura intensified even more. Hans threw his spear at Rydok with all his might, shouting that he would kill him. Rydok looked at this in shock. In an instant, the spear was right in front of Rydok's face. The hero, who gave off an incredible aura, said that he was not aiming at Rydok. This attack killed the knight's horse. He then landed on the ground. Now Rydok was left without a horse and stood on the ground, and in front of him lay the body of Hans' dead horse. The hero looked at him and realized that he was able to limit Rydok's movement, which was definitely good, but it took too much strength due to his berserker mode. Hans understood that Cadiz's skills were definitely strong, but at the same time, more endurance is required. The hero realized that to some extent he had become stronger thanks to Gerbir, because now he can reduce the consumption of stamina. The hero grabbed his trembling hand and realized that his muscles were already hurting. A red aura emanated from Rydok. He said that this had not happened for a long time. He stood in front of his dead horse and without a weapon in his hands. Rydok said it had been so many years since he had met someone who could make him dismount from his horse. He praised Hans, saying that he made the right decision in targeting his Albaros. He looked at his palm and said that Hans, however, was not capable of anything more. Suddenly he said the name of his horse. Rydok pointed his palm to the ground and an aura began to appear from there. He extended his hand, in which he held the newly materialized sword. Pointing his sword at Hans, the knight said that he was Ryok Schulin, and from now on he would use every opportunity available to him to kill him. There was no one around them. Only from afar did Lemelin watch this and pronounce the hero's name. The girl began to walk forward, saying that she had to stop the fight. Suddenly Lemelin noticed someone behind her. A man stopped behind her. It turned out to be Flop. He looked at her and asked what was going on. Lemelin pressed her hand to her chest and said excitedly that the master said he could end the battle. Flop admitted that in his opinion, her master overestimated himself too much. Flop asked if he should help him. However, Lemelin remained silent. Looking away, Lemelin said that Hans said not to challenge his decisions and just wait. Flop was wary and asked if her master was a tyrant. He also added that, of course, it was none of his business, but she should act if necessary. Grabbing the hilt of the sword, Flop looked forward and said that otherwise she would lose her master. Rydok took a fighting stance and announced the start of the second round. Hans was worried and annoyed because Rydok didn't even give him time to return the weapon. The hero thought that what was happening now was not a game, but reality, but there was inventory in the Black Ring of Bant. And here you have to drag everything you need with your hands and feet. Suddenly Hans turned around and shouted to Lemelin to throw him the sword. Lemelin immediately began looking for the sword in her backpack. Rydok looked at it and said it was bad. Suddenly, Rydok made an incredibly fast dash towards the hero. Hans, looking at this, realized that it was already too late. Lemelin continued to look for the sword in her backpack, but Flop interrupted her, saying that if she was not more collected, she would completely screw up at such moments. Flop threw his sword and shouted at Hans, calling him an iron head. Hans saw Flop throw him his sword. Flop also shouted that he would repay his hand. Hans reached for his sword just as Rydok swung his sword at him. Hans grabbed the sword. He immediately pulled the hilt and took it out of its sheath. Hans then punched Rydok back. They came face to face, both of them emanating a terrifying aura. As they crossed swords, Rydok said that this was not enough and he needed more. The hero at that moment realized that there was a huge difference between them. Sparks appeared from their sword strikes. The night was unusually long. Flop looked questioningly at the fact that Lemelin was still rummaging through his backpack. Lemelin blushed and decided that she wanted to be useful to her master. Rydok dealt Hans an incredible array of attacks. Rydok struck with his sword again and exclaimed that he no longer saw the same confidence in Hans. Hans blocked all of Rydok's attacks with his sword. Hans got angry and thought that Rydok would still get his way. Hans planned to wait until Rydok let down his guard and got used to his movements. Hans stood in a fighting stance but held on to his wound. He thought that he just needed to endure it. Hans looked at Rydok with determination and then said that he trained hard for this moment. Rydok turned to the hero and said that he, it seems, has no plans to give up yet. The knight changed his fighting stance and said that he recognized Hans' strength of spirit. The hero's aura intensified and he thought that Rydok had finally changed his position. Hans said the time has come. Then he swung his sword. He threw his sword at the spirit knight. However, Rydok easily repelled the attack and was therefore surprised that Hans had essentially thrown away his only weapon. The sword flew to the side and stuck into the ground. Lemelin and Flop were shocked. The sword lay behind Rydok, and therefore Hans would not have been able to take it. Ryok Schulin said that he underestimated Hans, even though he analyzed all of his attacks. A red aura began to appear around the knight's sword. He waved his sword and said it was time to end this. Then he crouched down to jump. A moment later, Rydok made a quick dash. The hero stuck his hand into the bag, trying to find something in it. He took out an explosive red stone from there. Hans threw the stone, thinking that he was not going to play by the rules. However, Rydok, continuing to run, cut the stone, shouting that it was useless. The stone began to glow and the knight began to worry because he realized that it was a crimson stone. Hands turned around and asked if Lemelin was ready. He saw that Lemelin threw some kind of weapon that looked like a trident in his direction. The girl bared her teeth and exclaimed in her thoughts that this time she would not slow down. There was a powerful explosion. There was an explosion against the backdrop of the full moon. Ryok stood behind the thick smoke and looked at Hands. He kicked the ground and the smoke around him cleared. The knight irritably asked if Hands really thought he could defeat him with this. Hands held the trident in his hands and said that this was certainly not the case, and therefore he prepared. In response, Ryok called it useless and asked where Hands' respect for him was. Hands held a trident in one hand and some kind of net in the other. He said he was serious all this time. Ryok looked at Hands silently, and the hero silently looked at his opponent. Ryok raised his head and grinned, saying that Hands was not worthy to be called a knight. He also asked if the hero thought he could take down Ryok Schulin with this thing. Hands continued to stare at Ryok silently, thinking that Ryok was underestimating him, as expected since Hands was using the net as a weapon. The hero decided that so be it, because he was better and therefore now was the moment. Hands furrowed his eyebrows and asked if a knight should really fight only with a sword. Ryok looked at him angrily and asked where he had seen a knight use a net. He said that even the warriors from the fishing village would not do this. Hands tilted his head to the side and looked questioningly at Ryok. He asked if Ryok would still treat him so arrogantly. Ryok was confused and did not understand why Hands spoke like that. The hero then tilted his head the other way and told Ryok not to pay and ask his boys to help next time. The ground at Rydok's feet began to tremble. The red aura around Rydok increased and he gave orders to the soldiers not to interfere with his duel. He waved his hand in their direction and exclaimed that this was a direct order. The soldiers looked at him in confusion. Suddenly they started stabbing their swords into the ground. All the soldiers stuck their swords into the ground. Flop raised his eyebrow and asked what was going on. Hands grinned, because Rydok bought it. The knight looked at him angrily and asked whether Hands really still dared to mock him. He extended his hand to the side and energy began to condense around his hand. A moment later, a shield appeared in his hand. The energy wave reached Hands, and therefore he took a defensive position. He narrowed his eyes and thought that he would never have defeated Rydok with his current powers if he had fought him the first time. Hands held the net in his hand, clearly preparing for something. Meanwhile, Rydok continued to rush towards him, holding his shield in front of him. Suddenly, the hero crouched down a little and swung the net. He quickly threw the net straight at Rydok. The knight swung his sword and called Hands mediocrity. The knight began to try to cut the network, but nothing worked. Hands, looking at this, thought that this was not just a net, but a net made from a large stem, and therefore it would not be so easy to cut. The net covered Rydok and he began to groan, and smoke began to emanate from him. Rydok was completely shrouded in a net and constrained in his movements. He realized that smoke was coming from him because holy water was affecting him. Hands began to remove his hood. At the same time, he, mocking Rydok, said that the net was also saturated with holy water and silver. Rydok tried to remove this net from himself while shouting insults towards Hands. The hero took off his mask and asked if Rydok really thought he would fight honestly when his own life was on the line. Hands smiled and said that he must live. Standing right in front of Rydok, the young man, holding a trident in his hands, said that now it was his turn. Flop was shocked because he saw Hands, and so the hero stood opposite the bound and helpless Rydok. Hands breathed heavily, his mouth open, and thought that this was quite difficult. The hero looked decisively at Rydok, knowing that the next part was not so difficult. He then began to think about the fact that the silver spear could not be obtained at the beginning of the game, as well as expensive holy water. A beginner following strict instructions would not be able to get them. He looked forward thoughtfully and thought that he was not like that at all. Hands began to walk towards Rydok while thinking about the huge amount of money received for defeating Duel. He took another step, thinking about the memories and abilities he received from the heroes. Hands took another step, remember the countless attempts to beat the game. The hero realized that despite all this, the siege of the Citadel still remains the most dangerous event. The hero calmly walked towards Rydok, thinking that he, however, did not come here without preparing. Hands frowned and his expression became menacing. He understood that this was a gladiator fight for life and death. The fight in which the chance of winning is much higher is Rishirius. Using the net to confine the opponent, the attacker impales him with the trident. Hands prepared to jump, crouching slightly as an aura appeared around him. The hero understood that this method was even more effective against a knight who fought according to the rules. Hands jumped up and was about to strike with his spear. Hands pierced Rydok's side with his spear and left a hole in him. Rydok realized that using the network was the right move to limit him. He raised his head and reflected that holy water and silver were his weaknesses, but this spear technique was different from the previous one. Suddenly Rydok cut the network, indignantly asking how this was even possible. For some reason Hands began to smile. Hands threw another net at Rydok and surprised him. He pulled out another net from his bag and asked if Rydok thought he only took one net with him. The net covered Rydok and he decided that he had to get out. Hands began to hit Rydok with his spear. The knight cut the net and said that it was not as difficult as it seemed. However, Hands threw another net and told Rydok to move back. The knight threw his shield into the net, saying that his shield would block this net and would not be caught again. The net covered Rydok and he wondered if Hands had really thrown two instead of one. The hero approached Rydok and took out another net, saying that this was not the first time he fought with him. Rydok was shocked because he realized something. He realized that Hands had come here on purpose. He purposefully challenged Rydok to a head-to-head duel, and now he uses the silver trident and holy water to finish Rydok. The knight looked at Hands and wondered if this was all planned. In a fit of anger, Rydok began shouting that this was impossible and that it was just luck. Hands began to run towards Rydok with the trident in his hands, while he shouted that it was all for the sake of mocking him. Coming close, Hands swung his spear and asked why Rydok didn't just admit defeat. Hands struck with his spear and pierced Rydok right in the chest. Rydok got angry at Hands and called him a jerk. He also encouraged Hands to fight honestly with a sword in his hands if he was a knight. The hero, meanwhile, tried to catch his breath, realizing that his stamina was already running out. However, he decided that he had another chance and he would not miss it. Rydok cut the net again and shouted that he would kill Hands. The hero frowned at Rydok and realized that this was the chance when Rydok was furious. Hands threw the net at Rydok again. However, the knight cut it and exclaimed that Hands had messed with the wrong one. The hero turned his back and recalled what he said. Hands turned around and said that this was not the first time this had happened to him. Rydok ran angrily towards Hands and shouted that this was nonsense. He came close to Hands and swung his sword, shouting that they had never met before. Rydok struck with his sword, but Hands moved to the side and dodged. Hands opened his eyes wide, focusing on something. He pulled one leg back and squatted down a little. A projection of Cadiz appeared behind Hands, showing that the hero was now using the Cadiz skill. Hands swung his spear using Cadiz's Silver Moon Spear skill. The hero also decided that he had to give it his all. Hands also used the body enhancement skill that Gerbir possessed. The hero struck with his spear and pierced Rydok's body. He hit the spear so hard that dark energy surged from Rydok's body. With this blow, he also pierced Rydok's heart. A column of dark energy shot into the sky. The spirit knights began to evaporate. Flop and Lemelin watched Hands closely as the knights behind them evaporated into dark energy. Hands stood right in front of Rydok, who was emitting terrifying energy. Rydok also began to evaporate. In a moment it was all over. Suddenly a necklace appeared in front of Hands. The hero looked at this and said that the event in the Citadel was over. He extended his hand to take the necklace and said that it was a hidden artifact that could be obtained by defeating Rydok in one-on-one combat. He took the necklace in his hands. Looking at him with annoyance, the hero said that it was all for the sake of this. He also added that this trinket would be useful to him in the future. Suddenly, an angry Flop approached Hands, shouting his name. Hands turned around and said in his thoughts that he had completely forgotten about him. The dark clouds disappeared and the northern lights appeared in the sky. Lemelin held Hands' helmet in her hands. She looked at Flop, who was approaching Hands. Flop was very unhappy and shouted the hero's name. He silently approached Hands, lowering his eyes. Suddenly he grabbed Hands and, baring his teeth, asked what kind of nonsense had just happened. He began to shout angrily and ask Hands what he forgot in this place. Flop was shocked because Hands had just said that he was not Hands. Flop took another step and told Hands not to fool him. Flop smiled happily and asked if Hands really thought that he didn't recognize him. Flop was still holding Hands by the cloak. The hero thought that even if he told Flop that he was another person stuck in this body, Flop would not believe him. Hands sighed dissatisfiedly, thinking that this was a real hassle. Hands swung his hand to hit Flop, who a moment ago wanted to ask him to say something. Lemelin was shocked. Hands started to leave and told her to follow him. He turned around and said that they were leaving here. However, he immediately said that she could stay if she wanted, because it was her business. Lemelin started shouting excitedly that she didn't want to stay here. Hands looked with a smile at Lemelin, who followed him, shouting for him not to leave her. Hands thoughtfully looked into the distance and thought that now after this incident, he needed to get away as soon as possible. After he single-handedly defeated Rydok, he will be followed and followed. Lemelin turned around and looked back. She looked at Flop, who was lying unconscious. Suddenly events take us to the village of Hands when it was burning. A man was walking along the bloody streets. Flop walked down the street, holding his shoulder. Flop looked down and realized that everyone in this village had died. Flop looked around and saw many corpses, but did not see Hands among them. He wondered if Hands was still alive. Suddenly, Flop's shoulder started to hurt a lot since his arm had already been cut off. Flop closed his eyes in pain, wondering at the same time what happened while he was passed out. He was also interested in the question of what happened to Hands. Flop turned around, looking at the village on fire, and said that he needed to find Hands. Flop didn't know whether Hands was alive or dead. After some time, Flop walked through the forest. He saw a girl in the distance who was attacked by a monster. Flop looked at this calmly and grinned, but there was no emotion on his face. Flop said that this monster is not as strong as the damn wolf he saw. Flop cut off the monster's head. He then showed the girl he had saved a drawing of Hans, but she shook her head, making it clear that she had not seen this man. Flop has killed countless monsters and saved many lives. Flop showed Hans's drawing to everyone, trying to find him, but he couldn't. He was always somewhere nearby, but couldn't find him. Flop even managed to fight an army of skeletons. As a result, meeting Hans became Flop's main goal. Flop was passed out, and the Alchemist was sitting next to him. Flop's goal became his obsession. He remembered how he had shown Hans's drawing to the Alchemist, but she only looked at the poster thoughtfully. He did this because Hans is his friend. And finally Flop saw Hans standing with a trident in his hands. Flop was stunned when I saw him. However, Hans immediately knocked out Flop, who happily began to talk about how they had met again. We are then transported to a dark forest full of owls. Hans sat near the fire and looked at a leaf. Lemelin turned around and asked Hans in surprise why he was burning the leaf. The hero brought the sheet to the fire and set it on fire. Looking at the fire, Hans said that it was a medicinal plant. When burned, it emits a scent that prevents monsters from appearing. Hans handed another leaf to Lemelin and said that if you burn it continuously for half an hour, the effect will last about 12 hours. He handed her the sheet and asked her to take it. They started throwing leaves into the fire. Silence reigned. Lemelin silently looked at Hans. The hero turned around and looked at Lemelin because she turned to him. Lemelin began to talk about how Hans has so much money and various weapons. Turning around, she asked in surprise who Hans really was. The hero, lowering his head, said that he was an ordinary wanderer. Lemelin began to talk about the strangers she had met, but Hans ordered her to be quieter, so she fell silent and looked away. Hans closed his eyes and began to sniff. At that moment, a person approached them. Lemelin began to worry and immediately turned to Hans. However, the hero, continuing to sit calmly, told her to forget about it because they were already surrounded. They were surrounded by some people in cloaks and armor. Hans thought it was just like a game. Lemelin held a sword in her hands and frightenedly called out to Hans. Behind them stood two more men in the bushes. Some fair-haired man began to talk to the knight and his escort. It was clear from his words that they needed Evan, the knight-errant. Hans, sitting with his back to him, asked who he was. The fair-haired man replied that he was the commander of the 5th Knightly Order of Pistans. Placing his hand on the armor, he introduced himself as Albedo Kelvin. Hans turned around and asked displeasedly what next. He was interested in what the Pistan soldiers were going to do to him. The knight, smiling, extended his hand and asked if the hero would mind walking with them, but Hans' logical question followed about why they needed this. Albedo smiled and replied that he couldn't say. Hans narrowed his eyes and asked what would happen if he refused and did not go. Reaching for the sword, Albedo replied that then, no matter how much he wanted, he would have to use more brutal methods of persuasion. Hans frowned because this irritated him. Hans exhaled and said that he did not want to allow such an outcome, and therefore, so be it, he will go. Albedo smiled and thanked Hans for his cooperation. Hans began to get up from the ground, at the same time thinking about the fact that Albedo uses the orders of the Emperor as a shield and threatens with a sword if something does not go the way he wants. Hans held his head and thought that they were gangsters, as expected of the Pistan's knights. Hans reached for his sword and the yellow aura around him intensified. Hans squinted and began to imagine in his head a situation where he nevertheless decided to resist. Hans quickly drew his sword. He decided that he would attack that overconfident worm Albedo first. He will then kill the guy behind him with sword wielding. Hans turned around, planning to rush into the others before the formation formed. However, when he turned around, he saw that a sword was pointed at Lemelin's throat. Hans exhaled in resignation and thought that this would remain only in his thoughts, because he could not yet use the full power of Cadiz. Hans removed his hand from his sword and looked at Albedo. The knight asked if Hans really wanted to start resisting. However, the hero began to wave his hand and say that he did not want this for anything in the world. He just wanted to avoid unnecessary problems. Suddenly Hans began to look angrily at Lemelin. The girl was scared and didn't understand why he was angry. At the same time, the hero thought that spying on them was still in his plans. Hans grinned and hit Lemelin on the head with the hilt of his sword. Going forward, he instructed Lemelin to grab their things. Standing behind Hans, Albedo happily said that they had prepared a carriage for him. The hero was feignedly surprised and thanked them sarcastically, saying that this was unexpected. Albedo laughed, but it was clear that Hans was irritating him. Albedo's face suddenly changed and he frowned. Albedo saw the real Hans at the moment when Hans reached his hand towards the sword and understood that there was definitely a killing intent in Hans. Smoke appeared at Hans' feet at that moment. Albedo also understood that Hans had clearly changed his mind when he removed his hand from the sword. The knight looked at Hans silently. He thought about the fact that those who trained with real weapons have a unique approach that is unique to them. so Albedo wondered if this meant that Hans used other weapons besides the sword. Albedo looked at him thoughtfully and thought that even one weapon was difficult to use, but Hans seemed to be able to skillfully handle several. But Albedo immediately decided that this was impossible. He looked at the back of Hans as he walked away and thought that he was probably making a mistake because he was tired, otherwise Hans must be a genius. After some time, Hans and Lemelin were already traveling somewhere in a carriage, accompanied by the Pistan's knights. The carriage was rushing somewhere at high speed. Hans asked Lemelin what she was afraid of. Lemelin, holding Hans' hand, replied that there were many men here. She tilted her head and said that she didn't like having a lot of them around her. Hans, while eating something, replied that he was also a guy, but at the same time he understood that she might not be talking about ordinary people. Hans remembered that he and Lemelin met at the market where they sell people. The hero understood that it was quite possible that before their meeting, Lemelin had been captured and sold to other men. Hans, eating another piece of jerky, thought that although Lemelin had seen other guys in the castle, she had never been so intimidated and did not cling to him. The hero realized that she seemed to have been captured by the soldiers. The hero looked out the carriage window and decided that this time he would not allow something like this to happen. It was dark outside, but the moon was shining. Hans, looking at this from the carriage window, understood that at this speed they would arrive by morning. He immediately said that their destination was Pistan's, but before that they needed to stop at one more place. He looked at one of the knights and said that this could be tiring for knights. Smiling evilly, Hans said that he didn't care about them at all. He also added that he and Lemelin can rest for now. After some time they were both asleep. Lemelin slept next to Hans, holding onto him. But suddenly she opened her eyes. Looking at the sleeping Hans, she thought that he was very strange because he always spoke harshly, trying to leave her. But at the same time, he always goes towards dangers. Lemelin looked at him happily, thinking that he always kept her away from danger and sometimes even took care of her. Sleeping Hans, meanwhile, was muttering displeasedly something about the level. Lemelin leaned against Hans's shoulder and, closing her eyes, said in her thoughts that she felt calm next to him. Lemelin was holding something that glowed blue in her hands and thought that if Hans found out about it, he would hate her like the others. Lemelin placed this blue object in her chest and a blue aura appeared around her. In her hands at that moment there was some kind of blue rectangular stone. After a while, when morning came, the carriage was still moving. Hans woke up with the sun's rays shining directly on his face. Hans was unhappy and annoyed because he still had not rested after the fight with Ryok. He looked at his hand, covered with aura, and thought that although he had gained experience and skills from the heroes, he could not use their power to the maximum. When fighting, Hans combines the skills of 3 heroes. Moving his hand, Hans said that since the skills were not perfect, there was a huge load on his body, so he decided that he needed to work on the connection of the skills. Lemelin continued to sleep and in her dream asked Hans not to leave her. The hero looked out the carriage window and thought that this was why he was heading to Pistan's. He said that they had almost arrived at the village. Hans then opened the window and looked at Albedo, who was just asking what was wrong. Hans pointed and said that he would appreciate it if Albedo did not go with them to the village. Albedo asked why he shouldn't go with them. Hans began to intimidate Albedo and, with a wince, said that there was a plague everywhere in that village. Albedo was confused. Hans looked at the sleeping Lemelin and said that he did not want her to get infected. However, Albedo replied that they would still head there. Hans, confused by Albedo's decision, asked if he knew exactly what the plague was. Albedo smiled and assured the hero that their priest would cure any illness. He put his hand to his chest and joyfully said that they were the righteous knights of Pistan's, and therefore it was unbearable for them to see the suffering of the weak. Hans smiled slyly. They continued moving and the same village appeared on the horizon. Residents joyfully greeted the knights who came to the village. The skin of the inhabitants was covered with something green and they asked Albedo to save them. Albedo turned around and began shouting to his subordinates to look for those villagers who needed help and also to check for monsters nearby. He also turned to the priest, ordering him to heal children and women first. Sleepy Hans and Lemelin got out of the carriage. Hans pointed and asked Albedo if he could look around, to which he received a positive response. Albedo looked at Hans and asked him not to go too far. According to him, the monsters that cause this disease may be nearby, and therefore Hans must be careful. As he left, Hans looked at Albedo Kelvin and realized that he was not mistaken, but the problem was not in the monsters, but in the village itself. He then turned to Lemelin, who was still sleepy and could barely open her eyes. He ordered her to prepare her equipment. The hero held his sword and looked around, thinking that the plague that the inhabitants of this village were suffering from was actually a disease of green moss. The body is eaten away by the disease as moss forms on the skin, causing terrible pain. If treatment is delayed, the person may die. An infected, emaciated woman noticed Hans and Lemelin. She turned to the hero and asked him to give her some water. The woman began to tearfully plead with Hans, saying that her child was dehydrated because he had nothing to drink. However, Hans silently turned away and walked on. Lemelin turned around and looked at these poor villagers. Lemelin stood up and excitedly turned to the hero. However, Hans only clicked displeasedly, looking at her. Hans quickly grabbed his sword. In an instant, Hans found himself in front of Lemelin. He threatened the residents with his sword and ordered them to move back. Hans calmly told them not to even dare approach. The woman began tearfully begging him not to kill her. Hans turned to Lemelin and ordered her to take water out of her bag and give water to the residents. Lemelin was delighted and thought that Hans was very attentive after all. Lemelin handed the flask of water to Hans. He immediately threw this water. The flask of water ended up in the woman's hands. Hans raised his head and ordered the woman to take this water and get out of here. The woman began to cry and thank Lemelin. Hans was shocked, thinking that it was actually he who gave her the water and it was Lemelin who received the gratitude. He turned around and warned his subordinate to be careful because the green moss disease was a plague transmitted by contact. Lemelin, stunned and frightened, asked if she could really get infected. Hans confirmed this and therefore ordered her not to approach anyone in this village. Then Lemelin exclaimed joyfully that this meant that she needed to stay close to Hans. The hero pointed his finger at the residents and ordered Lemelin not to even try to help them. Then she lowered her head and said that she would not do this if he forbade her. Hans grabbed his neck and, looking away, thought that there was no point in helping them. However, he saw that Lemelin was annoyed and did not want to force Lemelin to carry out his orders. Hans turned around and grinned and said that he would cut her salary. Hans looked at her carefully and said that if she became infected, she could consider that their communication was over because he was not going to take an infected person with him. Lemelin exclaimed joyfully that she understood him. Lemelin continued to pull water out of her backpack while Hans tried to remember what needed to be done for a new event to appear. However, he decided that since he couldn't remember, then it wasn't that important. After a while, Lemelin approached Hans, who was sitting by the well. She was very happy and thanked Hans. The hero pulled her by the backpack and said that he hoped they would stop begging for resources. And besides, according to Hans, if they give up a couple of bottles of water, they won't die. He thought that Lemelin probably wants to help the residents because she sees her past in them, but she must do something if she wants to continue their journey together. Hans looked at Lemelin, who was almost crying, and asked her to swear to him. Hans, holding Lemelin by the backpack, extended his hand directly over the well. While he held her, he told her that from now on she should not dare help anyone without his permission, no matter what the situation. Hans let Lemelin go and told her not to help others just like that, because it could end badly for her. Lemelin flew down and screamed. Lemelin fell to the bottom of the well, and Hans landed after her. They stood in pitch darkness, and there were remnants of water on the floor. Hans looked ahead and thought that this place had not changed a bit. Under the ground where they were, there were torches on the walls. The hero looked into the passage illuminated by torches. Hans reached for his helmet, and Lemelin asked him where they were. Hans, putting on his helmet, said that they were in the sewer passages, which were the source of the plague in the village. Hans remembered the appearance of some monster and said that this was also the territory of the so-called sewer ruler. Suddenly, a huge rat jumped on Hans while he was talking about how if Lemelin did not follow him, he would die. Hans immediately reached for his dagger. Hans killed the rat with a deft movement and asked if Lemelin was ready to be around even after that. The dead rat fell to the floor, but the strange thing was that the rat's blood was green. Lemelin looked at this with disgust and grumbled. She looked at the dead rat lying in a pool of green blood. Lemelin then shook her head. Hans handed her the dagger. Lemelin was clearly unhappy. Hans turned around and asked her why she was staring at him so much, because he taught her the basics of fighting. Lemelin looked at the dagger with displeasure and said that she was more comfortable with a crossbow. Hans, with his back to her, asked how long she was going to fight from a distance. He added that you need to be able to fight in close combat. Hans took out his sword after seeing a pack of large rats, while at the same time thinking that Lemelin needed more experience in order to survive. He ran towards the rats, thinking that since she had decided to become his companion, he would have to accept it. The rats turned their attention to the hero. They began to run out of the tunnel and run towards him. The rats were furious and their eyes were glowing red. Hans also ran towards them, holding a sword in his hands. The rat jumped into the air, about to bite Hans. However, he immediately cut it with his sword. Hans cut down several more rats that attacked him, but he missed one rat, which ran towards Lemelin. The hero looked around and thought that Lemelin should be able to stand up for herself when she is left alone. Lemelin closed her eyes and began waving her dagger. Even the rat was shocked and stopped. Hans killed another rat, but he continued to watch Lemelin, wondering if she was panicking when fighting against a single rat. He remembered the recent battle and said that although Lemelin had no experience, she surprisingly fought well the first time. But here the story is completely different and the opponents are stronger. The enemy is clearly visible. You can feel the sparkle in his eyes as well as the desire to kill. Lemelin is frightened by the feeling of the flesh being torn and the blade piercing the skin. All this comes together and paralyzes a person with fear. However, Cadiz's skills made Hans less susceptible to such things, but Hans would never forget that first battle. He remembered the battle against wolfkin. The hero looked at the frightened Lemelin and thought that she clearly had the fighting spirit of the Pibalds, but she lacked experience. Meanwhile, the rat stood up and bared its teeth. Hans thought about how pathetic it was to see her trying to hold the dagger in her hands. However, he understood that it was better to let her learn on her own from her mistakes because it would be useful to her in the future. Hans turned and looked at her, thinking that he wanted to make her into a warrior who could fight alone. Hans turned around and shouted to Lemelin to take a long stick from her backpack if she didn't want to die. The girl immediately reached for the stick. She took out a wooden stick and asked if it was the stick Hans was talking about. The hero confirmed this and told her to grab the stick tightly and hit it against the wall. Lemelin hit the wall with a stick and sparks appeared. The stick immediately began to burn. Lemelin looked at the stick in surprise because she realized what it was. Hans, looking at the burning stick, said that it was Llama's torch. He also advised not to drop this stick because it is expensive. According to Hans, weak monsters, like these plague rats, are afraid of light. Indeed, the rat began to hiss and move back. Hans asked Lemelin what she was doing and also ordered a beating. Lemelin asked him again in surprise. She stood in front of the rat, holding a torch and a dagger. The rat stood still and did not intend to attack. Lemelin frowned and thought that if she wants to stay close to her master, then she needs to stop hesitating because she cannot be afraid all her life. Lemelin closed her eyes and sighed, thinking that the master never doubts in such situations. Lemelin opened her eyes and frowned. She immediately ran towards the rat. With a deft movement, she stuck the dagger right into the rat's head. She pulled the dagger out of the rat and green blood poured out. Hans stood and looked at what Lemelin was doing. The girl turned around and took a deep breath. Hans praised her, calling her smart. In front of the heroes was the entrance to the sewer, illuminated by torches. Lemelin sighed heavily, looking down and also pronouncing the number of rats she had killed, which at the moment was 23. Hans stood behind Lemelin and looked at something. He touched the wall and said that the walls were still the same. Hans began to feel the bricks on the walls. He then picked up his bag, starting to search for something in it. Hans took a couple of red stones and said that it was time to meet the ruler of this place. He erected 2 stones in walls. He then quickly ran the stone across his armor, creating a spark, after which he threw this stone at 2 others lying near the wall. Hans put his hand on Lemelin's backpack and addressed her. Lemelin blushed because Hans grabbed her head and ordered her to bend down. However, she suddenly saw that the stone was about to explode. Lemelin realized this and was horrified. A moment later there was a powerful explosion. A large hole appeared in the wall. Hans sat and looked for something in his backpack. Lemelin, meanwhile, was passed out, her spirit separated from her body and laughing hysterically. The hero began to enter the hole in the wall and ordered Lemelin to stop reacting like that and follow him. Lemelin looked down and said in surprise that there were fewer rats here. The hero confirmed this and added that this is where they appear. They observed a small open area with many rats crawling around. Hans turned around and asked Lemelin if she was okay. The girl looked at him and made a pitiful face and replied that she was fine, but her backpack was a little heavy. Hans immediately said that he was asking about the smell. He asked her how she tolerated the smell. Lemelin smiled awkwardly and said that everything was fine. The hero thought that her stomach was stronger than it seemed. Meanwhile, the huge monster was sleeping. Hans, watching him, thought that he could shoot and kill the monster in one go. However, he also understood that if he did this, the plague rats would immediately attack him. Hans said he would be in a bad position. He immediately ordered Lemelin to give him the backpack. He placed a quiver of arrows on the ground. These are explosive arrows, the tips of which are made of firestone. Hans took one arrow and thought that Paul often used them. Lemelin also examined one arrow. She asked whether these arrows would reach accurately, because their tips are heavy and therefore the center of gravity is shifted forward. Hans had already begun to draw the string and asked her what she meant. Hans took aim and asked if she really thought he didn't know about it. The hero ordered her to watch carefully and remember this moment, because in the future it will be useful to her. Hans pulled the string tightly and said that the first one was at 13 o'clock. At the same time, he thought that he could handle it because he had the skill of a confident shot from Paval, who would not be considered a hero for no reason. Hans released the bowstring and fired, and the aura emanating from him intensified. The arrow began to fly, creating yellow lightning. Hans thought that getting there was not a problem, the question was different, where to shoot. The arrow landed near a hole in the ground. The arrow exploded and hit many rats inside the nest. Lemelin was surprised. The hero ordered the girl to give him another arrow. Hans fired again, but this time he shot in a different place. The arrow flew straight at one of the rats standing next to the hole in the ground. There was a powerful explosion again. Hans again ordered Lemelin to give him one arrow. Meanwhile, he was thinking that in the game the rats appear randomly, but here they all act the same and are in the same place. crowds of rats began to scatter in several directions. Hans, watching this, thought that this was nonsense because you could understand exactly where they were going. Hans drew the bowstring and took aim to shoot at the next hole. He fired and there was a powerful explosion. He fired again and destroyed the next hole. Another shot and another destroyed hole. Hans fired many more times, destroying the holes. Hans released the drawn bowstring and said that this was the last arrow. This arrow flew straight into a huge flock of rats. The arrow went straight into the rat's head. It then exploded and destroyed even more rats. Lemelin was shocked and started screaming. The huge monster continued to lie on the ground. However, he suddenly stood up and raised his head. This huge rat was looking straight at Hans and Lemelin. The hero also looked at her and asked if she had really woken up. The monster began to growl furiously. The monster raised its head and roared again. Then he turned around sharply. Hans stood directly in front of the monster and looked at it. The hero, continuing to stand calmly, turned to Lemelin and said that the monster was looking at her. Hans turned around, looked at the monster and asked what he would do now without his rats. He added that all he could do was cry. The monster raised its head and bared its teeth, becoming very angry. Hans, meanwhile, was thinking that this was a hidden dungeon, different from others. The monster slammed its hands onto the floor. Hans, meanwhile, thought that if everything had been as usual, he would not have arrived here after the Citadel. The monster immediately began to run towards Hans. The monster continued to recklessly rush towards Hans, and Hans himself thought that he had killed all the monsters, but could not defeat Kyrith. Hans put his hand into the inner pocket of his coat and thought it was time to choose a different strategy. Hans took out the artifact that he received after the battle in the Citadel. Hans held out the artifact and a dark aura began to emanate from it. The hero understood that this plan might not work, and therefore everything depended on Hans, whether he could make the artifact serve him or not. Hans ordered Ryok Schulin to appear. The red aura emanating from the artifact began to intensify. Hans stood on the ledge, holding the artifact in front of him. Ryok appeared under Hans. Schulin wanted to ask who summoned him, but there was a huge monster right in front of him. Green goo flew straight into Rydok's face as he wondered in shock what was happening. Ryok grabbed the face where the green slime had flown and asked what this nonsense was. Hans took off his helmet and, putting his hand to his chin, asked if the invulnerability buff really disappeared after being summoned. The monster's fist was already flying at Ryok while he was wondering where he was and what was going on. The monster hit Ryok with its fist. The knight flew back and hit the wall. The aura around Ryok intensified as he became angry. He materialized his sword Albaros in his hand. Hans waved his hand and shouted to Ryok that he believed in him. Ryok was furious and called Hans names. The hero crossed his arms and asked if Ryok really dared to say anything to his master. Ryok dodged another blow from the monster. However, at the same time, turning around, he asked the question of how Hans, a pathetic little man, could be his master. Hans showed him the pendant and said that he could be Rydok's master because the trinket now belonged to him. Ryok turned his back to the monster, which was about to hit him any second, and said that he did not recognize his duel with Hans. Ryok turned around and attacked the monster. Hans smiled and thought that he knew that Ryok would not obey him so easily and that he needed to push Ryok to do so. Hans told Ryok that he would not like to have such a weakling as Ryok under his command, and therefore he must prove what he is capable of. Ryok held back the onslaught of the monster and turned around shouting to Hans to come and fight the monster himself. Hans hung the pendant on the stone and said that Ryok doesn't seem to fully understand, because if he continues to treat Hans like this, he will leave him here. The gem on the necklace is Rydok's heart, but the same artifact can be made into his shackles. Ryok turned around and started yelling at Hans to take his time. The hero looked at him seriously and said that he had two options. Hans looked at the rat and said that either Ryok defeats this rat and becomes Hans' servant, or he remains to rot with these rats forever. Ryok started screaming and calling Hans a demon. Ryok struck with his sword and injured the rat. The knight asked that Hans really thought that he would listen to all this nonsense. The rat stepped back. Hans, standing on the ledge, said that the demon is the one with whom Ryok entered into a contract, and Hans is an ordinary person. Hans then said that Ryok had made his choice. At the same time, he thought that negotiations begin only when a person understands what situation he is in. Hans began to walk away, but Ryok immediately shouted and asked Hans to wait. The hero heard this and turned around. Ryok extended his hand and said that he would deal with this rat, but for this Hans must wait, because after that they could calmly discuss everything. Hans began to look for something in his backpack, while at the same time thinking that Ryok was arrogant because he dared to discuss conditions with his master. The hero took out some green stone and smiled and thought that it was worth punishing the disobedient servant. Hans threw a stone towards Ryok. The stone broke and some green gas began to emanate from it. This gas began to envelop the monster, who had no choice but to breathe this gas. The monster began to grow in size, its veins bulged, and it became even more enraged. Ryok was horrified and asked Hans what he had done. This magical stone has a strengthening effect. The monster's muscles increased, and sharp, large claws appeared on his hands. Kyrth's red eyes were fixed on Ryok. Hands knew that this magic stone worked great on monsters like Kyrth. The monster raised its hands and let out a furious roar. He hit the ground with his fists. The ground began to crack, sending plumes of smoke into the air. Ryok watched what Kyrth was doing closely as he continued to growl, calling smaller rats from the ground. Ryok assumed a fighting stance as the aura around him intensified. The knight was very unhappy with what Hands did. Ryok struck with his sword. With one blow he killed all the rats that ran towards him. Immediately, an enraged Kyrth rushed at Ryok. Hands began to wonder who Ryok Schulin was. The hero knew that this was one of the most honorable knights in the game. Ryok swung his sword and wounded Kyrth in the arm. Against the background of the battle, Hands thought that in this world knights are far from such a thing as honor. Kyrth, meanwhile, attacked Ryok, making terrible noises. Kyrth's strike hit Ryok. The knight stepped back and there was a slight pause in their battle. Hands, meanwhile, thought that this was precisely why he decided to completely deprive Ryok of honor. Hands smiled slyly and looked at Ryok. He then placed his hand on his helmet. Hands, having already put on his helmet, turned to Ryok and said that he seemed to be unable to cope. Hands jumped down to Ryok. The hero landed like a superhero. He raised his head and asked if Ryok needed help. However, Ryok, holding the sword in front of him, exclaimed that Hands should not joke with him like that because he could handle it himself. Hands, standing behind Ryok, wished him good luck. Ryok turned around and called Hands names while Kyrth's attack almost reached him. Ryok turned around and the aura around him intensified, and then he said that they were not finished yet. With one blow, Ryok cut off the monster's arm. Kyrth saw that his hand was no longer there and began to scream in horror. Ryok made a quick dash. The knight jumped at the monster, swinging his sword. There was a yellow sparkling aura emanating from Ryok and his sword. Ryok struck with his sword and inflicted a deep wound on the monster. Kyrth began to scream even more because now his shoulder was almost completely cut off. Kyrth weakened and fell to his knees. Ryok landed and the aura around him disappeared. Hands, looking at the knight from behind, thought in surprise that he knew that they had a big difference in strength, but nevertheless, Ryok killed Kyrth too easily. Hands thought that this is why Kyrth is the secret boss. Kyrth knelt, head bowed, as small rats ran out of the ground and rushed towards him. Ryok raised his head in surprise. Rats crawled on the monster's hand, healing the wounds. Ryok asked in surprise if this really meant that Kyrth could recover even from such wounds. The rats have almost completely restored the monster's severed shoulder. The aura around Rydok's sword intensified and the knight said that then he would continue to beat and cut the monster to the very end. Rydok, strengthening himself with an aura, began to walk towards the monster. Hands watched this closely and thought that Rydok was mistaken. He understood that Kyrth's strategy was simple. Rydok and Kyrth rushed at each other. Hands, meanwhile, was thinking that it was impossible to kill Kyrth without knowing all his tricks. Rydok struck again with his sword and severely wounded the monster. Hands understood that Kyrth was using his subordinates for endless regeneration, and therefore he could only be defeated by exhausting him. Rydok launched another attack. The hero, meanwhile, was thinking that such a trait of the monster as durability would not allow him to be exhausted. While Rydok continued to unleash numerous attacks, severely injuring the monster, Hands thought about the fact that when Kyrth's stamina dropped below 1%, his health would not decrease for 3 seconds. As long as the plague rats exist, Kyrth's health is virtually infinite. Kyrth held his severed hand in his other hand while the plague rats continued to heal him. Kyrth struck Rydok with his severed hand. The blow was so strong that Rydok was thrown back and hit a stone cliff. Rydok was on one knee, holding onto his sword because it was weakened. The knight shouted angrily that he fell to his knees before this monster. Rydok raised his head, intent on destroying the monster as quickly as possible. Hands understood that resilience could be used again and again, and therefore he needed to finish off Kyrth before he could fully recover. Realizing this, Hands threw something. The object he threw flew right next to Rydok's face. The red stone hit the monster's wounded shoulder. The stone exploded and tore off Kyrth's arm. Hands began to walk towards the monster, advising Rydok to watch carefully. Hands knew that Rydok had already activated Kyrth's durability and 3 seconds had passed. The hero ran to Kyrth, realizing that the monster would no longer be able to repeat this trick until he fully recovered. Kyrth, whose arm had been severed, prepared to attack Hands. The monster itself ran towards the hero. Kyrth raised his hand. An aura formed around Hands. Hands' sword collided with Kyrth's hand and a shockwave was created. Kyrth growled furiously as he continued his onslaught. Hands stood firmly on the ground, even though the monster managed to push him back a little. Kyrth held Hands' sword and therefore could not attack, because he does not have a second hand. Hands, looking at the monster, said that the monster seemed to be trying to gain time and come to its senses. The hero waved his sword and Kyrth let go of his sword. Hands changed his fighting stance, and his sword began to glow, emitting a bright light. The hero asked if Kyrith knew how many times he had already defeated him. Hans disappeared with a dream, making a dash. He found himself directly above the monster's head. Hans swung his sword and said it was time to end this. He hit Kyrith in the neck area. However, Hans continued to push with all his might. Finally, he managed to cut the monster into 2 parts. The monster was lying on the ground, so Hans returned the sword to its sheath. The hero reached for the stone that was in Kyrith's body. Ryok extended his hand and asked Hans in surprise how he did it. Hans turned around and said that he had high hopes for Ryok, but in vain. Hans held out Rydok's heart and told him to come back, because Hans didn't want to see him anymore. Ryok became agitated and began screaming for Hans to stop, but the process of Rydok's return had already begun. Hans looked at the gem and said that Rydok's attitude towards it had probably changed. The hero turned to Lemelin and told her to give him the backpack. Hans began to take off his helmet, thinking it was time to solve the problem in the village. Hans started telling Lemelin to come down. However, a moment later she was already flying down uncontrollably. Lemelin landed quickly, so Hans turned around in surprise. The girl was sitting on the ground with her hand to her chest. He looked at the exhausted Lemelin and wondered what was wrong with her. Hans also wondered if he could have just dropped his bag and gone down quietly. Having already taken off his cloak, Hans turned around and said that they had a lot to do, and therefore they should hurry up. Along the way, Hans drove iron stakes into the ground. He stuck a lot of these iron sticks into the ground. Hans looked ahead and said that he had found what he was looking for, but Lemelin was disgusted when she saw it. Dead rats lay in front of them. Hans looked to the side at the pile of these rats and thought that this was the ordeal of the Black Bant Ring. Looking at the many dead rats, Hans thought that this was what destroyed human existence. The action took place in a cave full of different stone columns. Hans waved his iron spear, thinking that the main factor that caused the plague to start in the village was the quality of the water. He stuck this iron spear into the ground, at the same time thinking that the plague rat, having settled in the sewer, had poisoned the water. Hans tied a rope around a spear stuck in the ground, thinking that the villagers were getting sick from drinking contaminated water. Hans also tied a red stone to the rope. Lemelin, holding Hans' helmet, asked him in surprise what he was going to do since it was a red stone. Hans, tying some blue stone to a rope, said that he was preparing a cleaning operation. Hans said that she already knows about the red stone. However, there is also a white magic stone that is sacred. Hans understood that if you clean the water with a fire stone, the polluted water should pour out. That is why Hans also uses a white stone, because it is this sacred stone that will purify the water. Lemelin opened her mouth in surprise. Lemelin began to remember how Hans treated the villagers cruelly. She thought that Hans did not care about the lives of the residents, but she realized that she was wrong. Lemelin lowered her eyes with a smile and thought that the owner was trying to eliminate the source of the problem. Lemelin joyfully asked him if she could help him, but Hans calmly refused her. Lemelin was unhappy, but still came to terms with it. She watched as Hans drove another spear into the ground. She watched with displeasure as he tied the rope to the spear. While Hans was tying the sacred stone to the rope, Lemelin looked intently and displeasedly straight at the back of his head. Hans turned around and saw Lemelin frowning and looking away. The hero closed his eyes and sighed. He asked if she still wanted to help. Lemelin was delighted and confirmed this. Hans looked at the hole in the rock and said that they would encounter some rats when they started to return. He ordered Lemelin to go and deal with them now. The girl was stunned and, with her mouth open, asked if Hans was really talking about plague rats. She pressed her hand to her chest and began to contradict. But suddenly she remembered Flop's words that she would lose Hans if she allowed fear to take over her. Flop also said that if she wasn't more collected at such moments, she would completely screw up, and besides, if Hans died, it would all be over. Lemelin frowned and decided that she couldn't stay here. Hans turned around and told Lemelin to show independence. However, he saw that Lemelin was already walking towards the exit to destroy the plague rats. Hans was surprised. Lemelin began to think that the servant's seal was no longer on her body. She decided to follow Hans of her own free will. At this moment, the girl had already climbed onto the ledge. Having climbed the rock, Lemelin realized that if this continues, he will consider her useless. Lemelin frowned and said that Hans had never asked her to do anything she couldn't do, and therefore, even if she was scared, she had to go there. Lemelin stood up and saw several plague rats in front of her. She didn't want to be abandoned again. She took out a dagger, realizing that in order to stay close to her master, she needed to become useful to him. She took off with a jerk. Lemelin began killing one rat after another. She killed several rats and took a break while a blue aura began to emanate from her dagger. The girl decided that she should become stronger. Morning came and the heroes were still in the sewers. Hans walked a long way, sticking spears into the ground and tying stones to ropes, while Lemelin killed rats behind him. Hans turned around, smiling, and thought about how until now he had not allowed Lemelin to fight on her own. Lemelin began to sweat and began to breathe heavily. This time Hans wanted to see what she would do when she faced danger alone. Several plague rats attacked Lemelin, but the girl managed to jump back. Hans watched and thought that Lemelin was trying to follow her instructions, although she was rather clumsy. Lemelin immediately cut down the plague rat that attacked her. Hans stood up with his hands on his hips and thought with a smile that that was enough for now. The girl turned around because Hans shouted her name. He said that if she was so defensive, she would miss the opportunity to attack. The girl took a fighting stance and said that she understood him. At this moment, 2 plague rats were approaching Lemelin. One rat jumped straight at Lemelin. The girl immediately swung her dagger. She easily plunged the dagger right into the throat of the plague rat. Then she turned around sharply and cut down the second rat. Lemelin was tired and therefore was breathing heavily. Suddenly another rat appeared from behind. The girl turned around in surprise, but someone had already attacked this rat. Hans saved her by kicking the rat. From Hans's blow, the rat flew back. The hero looked at Lemelin and asked her why she was fighting with this bag. Lemelin made a dissatisfied face and said that Hans asked to take care of this bag. Hans finished tying the stones to the ropes. He then tied a rope to Lemelin and said it was a rope to save her. The hero began to unwind the hook and said that now the rats would come running, and therefore she should simply hold them back until they rise. The girl turned around and asked, stunned, if she would really do this alone. Hans threw the hook up. With a hook, he managed to catch onto the stone casing of the well. Hans took hold of the rope and asked Lemelin that she really thought that he would leave her, but the girl replied that this was not so. She gripped the dagger tighter and thought that her master was not at all like the people she knew. The girl looked forward resolutely. Many rats ran towards her. Some time passed. Lemelin was holding one of the rats in her hands, stabbing a dagger into it, and many more dead rats lay at her feet. The girl looked forward and said with horror that there were a lot of these rats. Suddenly, throwing knives flew out of nowhere. Someone started killing rats by throwing weapons at them. Lemelin looked at this in surprise. She joyfully raised her head and mentally exclaimed that this was the master. Hans had a Gerbier aura about him. He held onto the rope to which Lemelin was tied. Hans tensed and began to pull on the rope. He applied force and quickly pulled the rope. Lemelin began to rise upward. Because Hans pulled the rope so quickly, Lemelin dropped the dagger. He lifted Lemelin higher and higher, and finally Lemelin was outside, but Hans pulled so fast that Lemelin flew into the air. However, the hero caught her and put her on his shoulder. He looked at her and said with a smile that she had done a good job. Hans began to think about the magic stone of Kyrda, and also about the subordination of Ryok Schulin, who at that moment could not accept that Hans was now his master. Lemelin was lying on her backpack, unconscious. Hans thought it would now be interesting to see how valuable it would become. However, he also understood that, of course, given that she was from the Paval tribe, there might be more disadvantages than advantages. Hans stood over the well, holding a red stone in his hands, and said that there was no need to worry about it now. Hans struck the red stone on the stone brick and sparks appeared. Holding a stone in his hands, the hero said that the necessary preparations were completed. He let go of the stone and said it was time to end this. The stone fell to the bottom and began to glow. Then the action moves to the village. Some gray-haired girl tried to heal people. Holding her hands in front of her, she used magic, summoning a yellow magic circle. However, suddenly the magic circle cracked and crumbled. The girl looked at the hand and asked if even holy magic didn't help. The infected resident, lowering his head, wondered in horror that he would really die like this. The girl turned to the captain. Kelvin frowned and asked if nothing could be done about it. Suddenly the ground began to shake violently. Kelvin turned around and saw that a column of clear water had hit the sky. The residents also saw this and began shouting joyfully that this was clean water. The woman clasped her hands together and, raising her head, exclaimed that heaven had given them water and had forgiven them. She also said that God rewarded them in this dry land for waiting patiently. The gray-haired girl, stunned, told the captain that there was something in the sky. Kelvin waved his hand and started shouting for everyone to get into line. Plague rats also poured out of the well along with the water. Albedo took up his sword and ordered the knights to protect all the villagers by destroying the falling monsters. Hans and Lemelin stood in a beautiful flowering meadow. Hans expected what happened. He looked at the clear water and thought that the knights could only kill the plague rats that had entered the village. Hans turned around and ordered Lemelin, who was picking flowers, to hurry up. Hans put his hand to his forehead and let out a surprised exclamation. He also said that they would be coming here soon. Lemelin, meanwhile, collected some purple flowers in bags. Kelvin walked up to Hans and, holding out his hand, said that he had finally found him. Kelvin asked Hans what they were doing here, and the hero turned around and just said that it was strange. Kelvin frowned angrily and clenched his teeth because Hans asked him that he really didn't say that he would look around himself. The hero thought that it was still necessary to maintain authority in order to maintain normal relations. Hans was saying something to Kelvin while Lemelin was running behind. Lemelin ran after the butterfly, trying to catch it. Kelvin frowned and began to ask Hans if something had happened in the well. He also asked if the water breakthrough was their fault. Hans replied that if the fact that he killed the monster was the reason, then probably yes. Kelvin put his hand to his forehead and began to think in surprise that, given the scale of the explosion, the monster was simply huge. He was interested in whether his knights would have defeated the monster. Kelvin looked at Hans in horror and thought that he couldn't even appreciate this guy's skills. Kelvin immediately calmed down and said that they would return to the village. Bowing and placing his hand over his heart, Kelvin said that they needed Hans' help to get rid of the consequences. Hans liked this attitude and asked Kelvin to wait. The hero picked up a purple flower and said that he wanted to collect more such flowers. Kelvin looked at him in surprise. Hans began to say that the plague rats in the village would simply run away in fear. He also said that there would be enough knights there to deal with the rats, and therefore by the time the heroes returned, everything would be over. Hans looked at Kelvin and said that the green moss disease in the village must be cured first. Kelvin asked in shock if Hans really knew how to treat this. The hero looked at the flower and said that one day he accidentally read from a book about diseases. He said that it might not be the right decision, but Hans thought it was worth a try. He turned to Lemelin and instructed her to collect these flowers. Meanwhile, Kelvin thought that he had already given up because even the sacred magic did not work. The knight said that in this case, you need to first check whether it will work. Kelvin frowned and said that if these flowers became a medicine, he would instruct the knights to make it. Hans smiled and said that they would do so then. Hans understood that there was no reason to refuse if help was offered. After some time they came to the village. The knights have already killed all the plague rats. Hans asked Kelvin where they were going, and he turned around and said that first they would go to the village chief because they needed to explain the whole situation. A resident came to the old man lying in bed and said that there were guests there. The gray-haired old man, lowering his head, said that the guests could enter. Hans, Lemelin, and Kelvin went to see the village chief, who was just beginning to thank them for visiting their village. However, suddenly the old man opened his mouth in shock and let out a surprised exclamation. He looked at Lemelin and wondered if this was the white-haired savior. Everyone looked at Lemelin while the village chief talked about how there was a prophecy in their village. The elder began to tell them about the prophecy. The day the white-haired savior arrives here, all suffering will be washed away. The old man calmed down and said that this is what the prophecy says. Hans thought, putting his hand to his chin, and asked if it was Lemelin. Hans looked at Lemelin, who had lowered her eyes, and thought that it was true that Lemelin was from the Piebald tribe, but if she was a savior or something like that, she would be much more useful than she is now. Hans looked at her intently and mentally said that he had saved her from the market where people were traded. He wondered what abilities she might have. The headman squeezed his hand and thanked the savior. The girl put her hand to her chest and said worriedly that she had done nothing. However, the headman smiled and joyfully said that he was saved when he saw her. Lemelin made a pitiful face and began to whine, turning to Hans. The hero approached the table and asked if there were any dishes here. He put the bag on the table and began to rummage through it. Hans took out a purple flower from his bag and said that they would make a medicine that could save everyone from the green moss disease. He decided that the white-haired savior would personally make this medicine. These purple flowers are ambroxia flowers grown in contaminated water. Lemelin placed these flowers and water purified with sacred stones in a wooden container. She started mixing and rubbing them together. Lemelin poured the mixture into a glass bottle, thinking she could make a cure for green moss disease. The girl looked joyfully at the medicine and mentally exclaimed that now they can help the villagers. Hans, meanwhile, was sitting on a bench near the headman's house. He was extremely unhappy that the trigger seemed to be activated. Lemelin passed by and noticed him. She approached him and smilingly said that thanks to the help of the knights, the village's illness was cured. Lemelin closed her eyes and thanked him loudly for helping the village. Hans made a displeased grimace and said that there was no need to thank him. The girl was stunned by his reaction. Then Kelvin noticed them. The knight turned to the hero, calling him Evan, and said that he seemed to be mistaken about him. Hans looked at him and wondered what he meant. Kelvin clenched his fist and, smiling widely, exclaimed that Hans was a good man who saved the weak. The hero sighed heavily and said that he did not do it for the sake of praise. Kelvin continued to praise Hans, saying that he has high moral principles of humility. Kelvin put his hand to his heart and, looking away, said that meeting Hans was a blessing for him. Hans was still unperturbed and thought that this was not what he wanted. Hans bared his teeth and began to wonder where his reward was because he had done so much. The hero turned around and lowered his head and began to talk about what he wanted, while Kelvin and Lemelin looked at him questioningly. Suddenly the headman approached them, followed by a man holding a tray in his hands. The headman said that he wanted to give the savior something. The headman said that this was a traditional dagger that was passed down to their village. According to the headman, there is a custom that when the white-haired savior comes, he should be handed over to her. The old man looked at her intently and said that he was convinced of something. The headman bowed and said that he was convinced that this savior was now standing before him. Lemelin felt awkward and ashamed, saying that she was not such a great person. Suddenly Hans came up and began to look at the dagger, putting his hand to his chin. The hero recognized this dagger as a real silver sword of silence. This is the last reward that can be obtained after completing the main story and completing the quest, the story of the leader of the village of Poxel. Hans, closing his eyes and putting his hand to his chin, thought that the functionality of this sword could not be compared with the effort expended, but still, there was nothing better for Lemelin now. The hero turned to Lemelin and instructed her to take this sword. She hesitantly asked if she could do this. Then she took this sword in her hand. Lemelin raised her sword to the sun and began to look at the patterns on the blade, at the same time being surprised. Hans looked at Lemelin, rejoicing at the sword, and thought that he would need to exchange this dagger for a reward. Lemelin turned around to see a gloomy Hans, who was musing that it was a little awkward that they were treating Lemelin this way, whose race was constantly being humiliated despite having gone through hard times. Suddenly Hans began to walk away and said that he needed to move to Stanza. After some time they were already sitting in the carriage. The carriage moved accompanied by the same knights sitting on horses. Along the way, they had to overcome rocky terrain. They stopped because their path was blocked by cobblestones. Hans lifted the huge boulder with ease, which shocked Kelvin. After some time, Lemelin looked out of the carriage window in surprise. One of the knights shouted to Kelvin that they were almost there because Stanz was on the horizon. A view of the majestic castle opened before them. This is the capital of Pistans, whose name is Stanz. The heroes went inside and walked along the corridors of the castle. Suddenly Kelvin stopped, and Hans stopped behind him. Kelvin turned around and said that he must warn that the Emperor is now in a very vulnerable state because a great evil has arisen on the border with Cheslow. Hans looked at him and asked in his thoughts how this related to the problem. However, he also thought that as expected, Bance Blackring's move was not much different from the game. Kelvin turned around and asked if Hans would still be wearing his helmet. The hero majestically replied that this was the armor of a knight-errant who saved the Citadel of Alban, which the Emperor was visiting. Kelvin closed his eyes and lowered his head, asking for forgiveness and saying that he realized that this was Hans's true knightly form. The hero looked at Kelvin and thought that he did not want to take off his helmet, simply because he could not control the expression on his face. Lemelin, horrified, asked Hans if he could really meet the king. He replied that he would take care of everything and she just needed to keep her mouth shut. Hans ordered her to do this, because from now on, for any wrong word they will have their heads cut off. They approached the majestic gates leading to the king's room. At the entrance stood two knights who greeted Kelvin. Kelvin said they came to meet the king. And so the knights began to open the doors. As soon as the door opened, they saw a throne on a raised platform on which the king sat. The golden-haired king had long hair, a crown on his head, and a scepter in his hand. Kelvin turned to the king and said that he had brought the hero who saved the Alban Citadel, the errant knight Evan. The blue-eyed king frowned and looked at them intently. He turned to Hans and asked if he really was the hero of the Alban Citadel. Hans and Lemelin stood directly in front of the king. He raised his head and looked at them with a frown. Hans knelt down and bowed, saying that it was a great honor for him to meet the great king of Pistans. Lemelin also knelt down and bowed. She looked up excitedly. The king closed his eyes and thought about something. Then he opened his eyes and asked Hans if he knew that the word Raz means ancient and the word Grad means fortress. Hans suddenly looked at the king in surprise because he had mentioned a creature known as Razgard. Hans became gloomy and looked at the king silently. Hans began to think about the monster that rains down 1,000 weapons. He knew that this was an ancient surf demon. This is a huge dragon-like monster with a terrifying purple aura whose name is Razgard. According to history, there was a hero who accepted the main task to defeat this demon. Hans was surprised by the fact that the king was telling him about this now. Hans's hand began to tremble because he wondered if this really meant that the hero was already dead. Hans looked down and realized that he was unable to follow the demon in his current state, and therefore it was akin to suicide. Hans lowered his head and said that there was no way a mere mercenary like him could handle this demon. The king frowned and said that it was strange because he had not even said a word yet. Hans, still with his head down, replied that he felt that the king was going to entrust him with dealing with this demon. The king put his hand to his chin and said that this was not so, but it was related to this. The king and the heroes were alone. The king said that he called them because he wanted to ask them for help, because he had no intention of forcing Hans to fight the demon alone. Hans raised his head in surprise because the king said that there was already a hero chosen to kill the demon. According to the king, he expects Hans to help the hero. Some time passed, the action was still taking place in the city of Stanza. The sun's rays hit the windows, illuminating the rooms. The king simply stood and looked out the window. At that moment someone approached him. The king looked back because someone had addressed him. It turned out to be Kelvin. He bowed and began to express doubts that Hans was not a simple mercenary, judging by what Kelvin had seen. The king stopped him and, closing his eyes, said that he understood what Kelvin wanted to say. The king opened his eyes and said that he guessed that the identity of this mercenary had not been properly verified. Kelvin lowered his head and confirmed this, adding that they knew he was a commoner by birth. Putting his hand to his chin and raising his head, the king said that Hans seemed to know proper etiquette and even the rules of court life. Suddenly the king looked at Kelvin gloomily and said that he had met countless people in his life as king. According to him, among them, of course, there were many mercenaries. However, the mercenaries standing in front of him were only divided into two categories. The king turned around, and a red aura formed around him. He said that among the mercenaries there were those who trembled with fear, as well as those who were very rude. With his back to Kelvin, the king said that he himself had mentioned that the depth of this mercenary's skill was incredible. Kelvin lowered his head and, closing his eyes, said that he was ashamed to say this, but it was true. The king put his hand on his shoulder and asked him not to worry about it, because the king appreciates him because Kelvin is a straightforward person. He turned around again and, looking out the window, began to say that he felt that this mercenary was different from the usual mercenaries he had encountered, and therefore he decided to establish a connection with him. Making an annoyed expression on his face, Kelvin asked what would happen if Hans did not live up to the king's expectations. The king replied that that would be unfortunate indeed. The action takes us to Hans, who at that moment was in the waiting room. The maid bowed to Hans and asked them to let her know if they needed anything. There were many different sweets on the table. Lemelin looked admiringly at the trays of sweets. However, Hans, taking off his helmet, told her not to eat too much. Having taken off his armor, Hans sat down on the sofa and relaxed, sighing with relief. He began to think that he already had a small idea of what King Pistans wanted to achieve. This purpose is to send the hero to fight against the demon in order to appease the public. Moreover, Razgard's habitat is a little closer to Cheslow. He understood that if the demon was not stopped, Cheslow would receive more damage than Pistans. Hans lay with his arms crossed and talked about how Cheslow, in desperation, would deploy his own military forces, while Pistans would use the excuse of having a hero who saved the nation to avoid draining his own resources. This all means that Pistans will not suffer any losses. Hans suddenly remembered how he had played, and so, grinning, he said that the thrill he felt when he first went down the route to kill the king was something he would never forget. Lemelin looked at Hans in shock as he said that this time the reward was worth not going down the path of killing the king. Lemelin, while devouring sweets, said that she probably heard poorly, because no matter what he was, Hans would not have done this. Meanwhile, a man emitting a white aura was approaching them. Lemelin felt this and immediately turned around. Lemelin got scared and began to tremble, so she approached Hans. Lemelin, holding on to her pendant, said that someone was approaching them and, it seemed, this someone was quite powerful. Hans looked at the door, knowing that the Piebald tribe were quite sensitive to the presence of others. However, what surprised Hans was that Lemelin felt it through the wall. The images of heroes began to emerge in Hans's memory, and he himself suggested that these could be powerful NPCs from Pistans. However, they should all be on the border, not in the royal capital. Hans thought and closed his eyes, putting his hand to his chin. He opened his eyes and said that this means that this is the same hero. This hero stopped right in front of the door. Hans and Lemelin were waiting, staring at the door. The hero grabbed the handle and began to open the door. The door opened and the silhouette of a man appeared. Hans saw a gray-haired man in front of him and seemed to recognize him. Hans frowned and mentally said that this was Ferox Hesline. The action still took place in a luxurious room. A gray-haired guy stood in front of the hero. This blue-eyed man had a large scar on his face. He turned to Hans and asked if he was Evan. Hans at the same time reflected that among the many heroes of the Bant Ring, it was this character that had the most effort put into creating it. An episodic character who can be called part of the main story. This gray-haired guy, whose face is covered with a large scar, is the master of weapons, Ferox Hesline. Ferox bowed and introduced himself, saying that he had received orders from the king. Hans shook his head and said that Ferox was the same hero, and also added that he had heard about him. Ferox grabbed his head and, waving his hand, began to laugh and ask Hans not to call him that. He lowered his eyes and said that he was doing this simply because he had such a chance. The hero wondered whether the characteristics of the character Ferox Hesline had changed significantly. Hans looked at Ferox with a smile and thought that if this was so, then the situation had not changed much. The hero extended his hand and introduced himself, and also introduced his assistant Lemelin to Ferox, which embarrassed her. Lemelin bowed and greeted the weapon master. Ferox happily introduced himself again and said that he was pleased to meet them. After some time, the heroes were outside the castle. Hans stood in front of a box containing many wooden swords. Hans thought that Ferox Hesline was a typical developing game character. The hero reached for his sword and took one. Hans knew that Ferox was known for its very slow growth rate. Hans looked at the wooden sword and thought that in this case, no matter what Ferox did, he would not be able to kill the demon. Hans lowered his hand and looked to the side. Ferox stood in front of him, also holding a wooden sword. Hans decided to check the weapon master. The hero addressed him, calling him master. However, Ferox replied that Hans should simply call him by name. The hero looked at him seriously and said that he needed to do something. Ferox took the sword with both hands and agreed. They both watched each other intently. Hans took off with a jerk. He quickly approached Ferox and swung his sword. Hans frowned and waved his sword. He struck at Ferox, but the weapon master was able to block the attack. Ferox looked at him in surprise and thought that Hans was fast. The hero jumped and swung his sword again. However, Ferox blocked this attack as well, holding his sword in front of him. Ferox counterattacked, but Hans managed to fight back. Ferox attacked again, but Hans managed to duck under it. Swinging his sword, Hans wondered if this was all Ferox could do. A yellow aura formed around Hans and he mentally said that Cadiz was striking. Hans swung his sword and was about to hit Ferox in the stomach. Suddenly the weapon master closed his eyes. He opened them and they glowed blue. Ferox seemed to stop time because Hans froze. Ferox looked at the wooden sword that Hans held in his hands, calculating its trajectory. Suddenly, time continued to flow and Ferox dodged the attack perfectly. Hans narrowed his eyes at Ferox, and he, in turn, looked intently at Hans. The sword of one of them flew into the air and then fell and stuck into the ground. Hans looked in surprise at Ferox, who leaned a wooden sword against him. Ferox smiled, and Hans spread his arms and said that he was smitten. Smiling awkwardly, Ferox asked that Hans treat him like he should and not like he did today. Ferox then looked at his trembling hand in surprise, while Hans, meanwhile, reflected that Ferox's powers were much greater than he had imagined. Contrary to Hans' fears, Ferox has grown quite a lot. The hero put his hand to his chin and began to think that this would be impossible. Ferox and Hans stood opposite each other, recovering from their fight. Lemelin watched them all this time. Suddenly a man started clapping. Lemelin turned around and saw this clapping man standing behind her. He smiled and said that this was a skill that Lartenian himself would recommend. Hans and Ferox looked at the man, realizing that it was Joseph. Ferox pointed at Joseph and said that he forgot to introduce him. He said that this merchant was with him, and therefore he would join them on their journey as a supply and driver. The red-haired man with a pigtail smiled and extended his hand, saying that he was pleased to meet you and that they could just call him Joseph. Now it became clear to Hans why Ferox's skills had grown so much. Hans smiled slyly, clearly planning something, and introduced himself, calling himself Evan. That's how this video ends. If you have sat through to the end, please don't forget to press the subscribe button and leave feedback. See you in the next video.